Welkom, dames en heren. Mijn naam is Pieter Rijens Kappers. Ik ben voorzitter van de Koninklijke Vereniging van Vrienden der Aziatische Kunst. De meesten van u zullen dat weten, maar we hebben ook gasten die ons nog niet kennen en waarvan ik natuurlijk hoop dat u allemaal heel snel lid wordt ook van de vereniging. We hebben een studiemiddag, een spannende studiemiddag en die gaat over speuren naar herkomst. Verhalen van Aziatische kunstobjecten in musea. Ik heb een paar punten van orde. Allereerst vraag ik u uw telefoon uit te zetten. Verder, welkom degenen die nu in de live uitzending, de livestream, ons programma volgen. U kunt later in het programma ook vragen stellen via de live chat. We vallen momenteel nog onder de coronavoorschriften, waaronder de 1,5 meter. Daarom hebben we nog wat regels waar we aan ons moeten houden en is het aantal bezoekers beperkt. Dat is jammer. Binnenkort wordt het verruimd, dat weet u. Over 2 weken hadden we helemaal volgezeten. Het is zo en we kunnen het niet veranderen. Maar het is wel fijn voor de toekomstige programmering en echt even een hart onder de riem. Maar vandaag dus, om zoveel mogelijk leden en belangstellenden in staat te stellen dit programma te volgen, hebben wij in samenwerking met Fantavision een livestream georganiseerd. En die kijker thuis heten wij dus ook van harte welkom met u hier. Welcome Alexandra Green from London. We are sorry, many presentations are in Dutch, other presentations are in English, but yesterday we had a lovely dinner and we told you what was going to happen, what was going to be discussed. So, but your Dutch will definitely improve. De bedoeling is volgens de coronaregels dat u zich niet te veel verplaatst. Tijdens de pauze wordt iets te drinken en een versnapering uitgedeeld. Dat kunt u ophalen bij de catering, dat is weer in de foyer. De bedoeling is voor het verkeer dat u die kant omhoog gaat, deze kant omlaag. En bij het zitten dus ruimte tussen elkaar houdt. U heeft allemaal het programma. We hebben boeiende sprekers over een belangrijk onderwerp dat steeds meer in de belangstelling staat en dat is ook terecht. De bedoeling is vanmiddag dat we eerst een aantal presentaties hebben, dat we die beluisteren en na de sprekers hebben we dan een uitvoerige Q&A onder leiding van René Steenbergen waar u vragen kunt stellen en we hopen op een levendige uitwisseling. In de pauze staan onze bestuursleden nog even op. Daar kunt u ook vragen aan stellen. Die geven dat dan door aan René Steenbergen. Maar we zullen ook, natuurlijk kunnen we dat live doen in de Q&A. En de kijkers online kunnen vragen stellen in de chatfunctie. Rosalien van der Poel zit achter in de zaal en die houdt de chatfunctie in de gaten en ook de livestream. En verder natuurlijk het voortreffelijke team van het Rijksmuseum en Fantavision. Hartelijk dank daarvoor. De Q&A zal in het Engels zijn, maar de vragen kunnen gewoon in het Nederlands ook worden gesteld. We beginnen nu met een introductie van Taco Dibbits, de hoofddirecteur van het Rijksmuseum, die er helaas zelf niet kon zijn vanwege buitenlands verblijf. Maar ik vind het zeer belangrijk, ook dit onderwerp gaat hem zeer aan het hart. En daarom zal hij u eerst per video toespreken.
Dames en heren, vrienden. Welkom in het Rijksmuseum, uw Rijksmuseum. Ik ben blij dat u vandaag aanwezig kunt zijn bij de studiemiddag Speuren naar herkomst van de Koninklijke Vereniging van Vrienden van de Aziatische Kunst. Ik moet mijzelf helaas verontschuldigen, vandaar deze videoboodschap. Ik ben verheugd dat de VVAK het initiatief heeft genomen voor deze studiemiddag. Het is hoog tijd dat koloniale herkomst meer aandacht krijgt in het Rijksmuseum. Het is belangrijk om dit meer op de agenda te zetten, nu er in Nederland van overheidswegen beleid in de maak is en er ook aan de universiteiten onderzoeksprojecten worden gestart. We zijn blij met Prootje, waar u straks meer over hoort, en Pressing Matter, het grote mbo-project dat een veelheid van aspecten onder de loep neemt. Hoe kunnen we voorwerpen bijdragen aan de verwerking van het koloniale verleden? Welke kanten zijn er aan het concept van eigenaarschap van verschillende partijen. Hoe kan de museale praktijk bijdragen aan een inclusievere maatschappij? Dit zijn allemaal punten die het Rijksmuseum nauw aan het hart liggen en uiteraard neemt het Rijksmuseum van harte aan het onderzoek deel. In het Rijksmuseum doen conservatoren al decennia lang onderzoek naar herkomst van Aziatische voorwerpen. En daarbij kwamen ook koloniale aspecten aan bod. Maar het is heel goed dat de koloniale context echt centraal staat in zelfstandig onderzoek. Daar heeft het museum een begin mee gemaakt en in de komende jaren zal de collectie verder onder de loep worden genomen. Het onderzoek zal tijd in beslag nemen, want ervaring leert dat elk voorwerp zijn eigen verhaal vertelt. De herkomstverhalen zijn divers en alle stemmen die daaruit naar boven komen, zullen moeten worden gebruikt om de verhalen die het museum vertelt rijker te maken. Dit is onderdeel van een breder beleid van het museum. Koloniaal herkomstonderzoek kan een sleutel zijn tot samenwerking. We merken dat er veel belangstelling voor het onderzoek bestaat bij onze partners in landen van herkomst en ik hoop dat we door met elkaar onderzoek te doen een duurzame band kunnen opbouwen. Vandaag gaan we hierover graag in gesprek. Het onderzoek, zoals u vandaag gepresenteerd krijgt door William Southworth, zal dienen als voedingsbodem. De specialisten van het museum bestuderen voorwerpen en publiceren de resultaten van hun onderzoekingen zo breed en open mogelijk, zodat ze ingrediënten kunnen zijn voor gesprekken zoals vandaag. Maar het Rijksmuseum is uiteraard niet de enige die de ingrediënten aanlevert. We hebben uw kennis nodig om ons verder te brengen, vandaag en in de toekomst. Ik wens u dan ook een vruchtbare middag toe en kijk er naar uit om de resultaten te horen.
Dank Taco. U ziet hoeveel belang het Rijksmuseum hecht aan herkomstonderzoek en de verhalen die verbonden zijn met de objecten in het museum. En dat belang geldt evenzeer voor de Koninklijke Vereniging van Vrienden der Aziatische Kunst. Ja. Over het verzamelbeleid van de vereniging spreekt René Steenbergen later vanmiddag. Maar een paar thema's en aanleidingen wil ik noemen. In oktober 2020 verscheen het rapport Koloniale Collecties en Erkenning van Onrecht. Een advies van de Adviescommissie Nationaal Beleidskader Koloniale Collecties van de Raad voor Cultuur. Het advies is gedetailleerd. Een aantal van u hier kent het goed, maar anderen minder. In hoofdlijnen komt het erop neer dat de adviescommissie de minister van OCMW adviseert als inzet voor beleidsontwikkeling om een richting de landen waar door Nederland koloniaal gezag is uitgeoefend, de bereidheid uit te spreken tot een onvoorwaardelijke teruggave van alle cultuurgoederen waarvan met een redelijke mate van zekerheid kan worden aangetoond dat de herkomstlanden deze indertijd onvrijwillig zijn kwijtgeraakt en die vervolgens in bezit van de Nederlandse staat zijn gekomen. Het gaat volgens de commissie om erkenning van onrecht. Het advies van de commissie is om met het civiele eigendomsrecht en verjaring in deze gevallen geen rekening te houden. De commissie adviseerde tevens richting deze herkomstlanden aan te geven dat Nederland ook bereid is om verzoeken tot teruggave in overweging te nemen van cultuurgoederen in rijksbezit, waarvan de herkomstgeschiedenis niet kan worden vastgesteld of niet wijst op onvrijwillig bezitsverlies. Dit voor zover deze cultuurgoederen voor het land van herkomst een bijzonder cultureel, historisch of religieus belang vertegenwoordigen. En anders dan het geval is bij onvrijwillig verloren gegaane cultuurgoederen, is het advies van die commissie bij een oordeel over dergelijke verzoeken dat het belang van teruggave voor het herkomstland naar redelijkheid en billijkheid dient te worden afgewogen tegen andere relevante belangen. De commissie adviseerde ook om verzoeken in behandeling te nemen tot teruggave van cultuurgoederen in rijksbezit van landen die door andere mogendheden waren gekoloniseerd. En de commissie adviseerde om een expertisecentrum herkomst koloniale cultuurgoederen op te richten met als taken de verificatie van de herkomst bij teruggaveverzoeken, het voor zover nodig doen of laten van aanvullend herkomstonderzoek, het opzetten van een database, het bevorderen van deskundigheid. Een noodzakelijke voorwaarde voor het uitvoeren van de door de commissie geadviseerde beleidslijn is kennis over wat er in de Nederlandse musea aan koloniale cultuurgoederen aanwezig is en over de wijze waarop deze cultuurgoederen zijn verworven. De commissie adviseerde de minister om de musea te wijzen op hun verantwoordelijkheid voor het doen van onderzoek naar de herkomstgeschiedenis van hun koloniale cultuurgoederen en hun kennis daarover toegankelijk te maken voor de herkomstlanden en natuurlijk ook voor het publiek. Over de advisering is het nodige besproken. Er is veel gepubliceerd. Er is ook een levendige discussie geweest en er zijn natuurlijk verschillende invalshoeken. Het beleid wordt verder ontwikkeld. Kortheidshalve ga ik daar nu niet op in, want dat is toch een ander traject wat zeker plaats gaat vinden. Maar ik wilde u even die achtergrond schetsen. Duidelijk is inmiddels wel dat de omzetting in beleid door het ministerie van OCW, waaronder ook het restitutiebeleid, zal gaan om cultuurgoederen in eigendom van de Nederlandse staat. Dus niet over objecten in particuliere eigendom, zoals bijvoorbeeld de collectie van de KVVAK. Inmiddels zijn er diverse initiatieven op het gebied van onderzoek naar herkomstgeschiedenis. Die zullen aan de orde komen. Ook de musea hebben een verantwoordelijkheid, waartoe zij ook door de commissie waren opgeroepen, maar ook eerder trouwens, voor het doen van herkomstonderzoek opgepakt. Deels in samenwerkingsverbanden en met NIOT, het Proose onderzoek waar we vandaag meer over heden, dat was al gestart nog voor het rapport van de commissie. In ieder geval wordt u daarover door verschillende sprekers vandaag bijgepraat, vooral aan de hand van voorbeelden, zodat er een goed beeld ontstaat over onderzoek. Het grote belang van zorgvuldig onderzoek naar herkomst of provenance wordt ook door de vereniging gedeeld. Dat is in feite altijd al de positie geweest. De geschiedenis van de oorsprong van de collectie van de KVVAK wijkt af. In die zin dat alle omstreeks nu 1850 stukken door de vereniging zijn verworven door aankoop, door schenking of vererving en in enkele gevallen overdracht door oudheidkundige diensten. Bij de verwervingen werd en wordt gekeken naar artisticiteit, naar zeldzaamheid en kunsthistorisch perspectief. Geen exportkunst, de leden weten dat. Het hele Aziatisch gebied werd en wordt daarin betrokken vanaf de oprichting. Het is logisch vanuit historisch perspectief dat daarin oorspronkelijk ook een grote rol was weggelegd voor het huidige Indonesië. Maar we spreken echt over heel Azië. Er is een uitvoerig archief over alle verwervingen in papier, dus niet digitaal, en dat is voor studie toegankelijk. In het 112-jarig bestaan van de vereniging is altijd uitvoerig bestudeerd, gepubliceerd in Aziatische kunst en volledige openheid betracht over de verwervingen en bronnen daarvan, die ook trots in de jaarverslagen werden vermeld. René Steenbergen zal hier vanmiddag ook op ingaan. Wat veranderd is de blik. Ook op provenance. Bij de recentere en nieuwe verwervingen wordt in nauw overleg met ons huis, het Rijksmuseum, gekeken naar herkomst. Onder andere ook natuurlijk naar de UNESCO guidelines. Wat naar Nederlands recht volkomen zuiver eigendom oplevert, wordt toch kritisch bekeken. Er is ook een moreel appel. En als vereniging kijken we daarnaar. En zo kan het zijn dat schenkingen niet worden aanvaard en aankopen niet worden gedaan omdat een heldere provenance ontbreekt. Hoewel juridisch eigendom van de aanbieder en ook misschien de goede trouw buiten kijf staat. Toch, als er iets ontbreekt, dan kunnen we het niet doen. Wat objecten uit de bestaande collectie van de KVVK betreft, kijken we dus ook in de lijn van de ontwikkelingen met ondersteuning van het Rijksmuseum en de conservatoren en andere professionals zorgvuldig naar herkomst. als er redenen voor zijn of als er lacunes zijn, maar wel met een wetenschappelijke benadering en per object. De discussie hierover en de studie zal worden voortgezet, samen met het Rijksmuseum en andere instellingen. Inzichten kunnen en zullen wijzigen. We houden u op de hoogte in ons tijdschrift Aziatische Kunst en in de bijeenkomsten. Vandaag zetten we in ieder geval daar verdere stappen in. En het woord zal thans zijn aan de andere sprekers. Ik introduceer nu Klaas Stutje. Klaas Stutje is als historicus betrokken bij het pilotproject Provenance Research on Objects of the Colonial Era, PROCE met dubbel P. En dat is een samenwerkingsverband tussen het NIOD, het Rijksmuseum en het Nationaal Museum voor Wereldculturen. Hij verricht herkomstonderzoek naar een grote selectie museumobjecten uit koloniaal Indonesië. Het onderzoek doet ook onderzoek naar objecten uit Sri Lanka. Uiteindelijk moet dit project leiden tot methodologische aanbevelingen. Al eerder verrichtte Stutje onderzoek naar Nederlands imperialisme en koloniaal Indonesië en heeft daarover gepubliceerd. Klaas, aan jou het woord.
Zo. Even kijken, hiermee kan ik rechts en links, hè, denk ik. Ben ik goed te horen? Ja? Oké. Nou, dank u wel. Hartelijk dank voor uw mooie introductie. En laat ik ook beginnen met een hartelijke dankzegging aan het bestuur van de vereniging voor de uitnodiging om op deze gelegenheid iets te vertellen over ons project. PROCE, of PROCE, ik zal er zo meer over vertellen. En over de praktijk van herkomstonderzoek naar objecten met een koloniaal verleden. Even kijken, ja, hij doet het. Ik wil in deze presentatie een aantal minuten besteden aan ons project, PROCE, en de context waarin we zijn ontstaan. Wie zijn we? Wat doen we? Ik wil ook 2 objecten die we onderzoeken nader toelichten om u een idee te geven van de reikwijdte en de diepgang van het onderzoek dat we doen. En ik wil uiteindelijk ook afsluiten met een aantal observaties en misschien ook een beroep doen op de expertise hier vandaag aanwezig, bij u ook. Nou, zoals zojuist al is aangestipt door de heer Ariens Kapper en de heer Dibbits, die verwees er ook al naar, staat het onderwerp van de omgang met museale collecties, met een koloniaal verleden, natuurlijk volop in de belangstelling. Internationaal, maar ook in Nederland. Ik geef u slechts een losse greep van recente gebeurtenissen, zoals bijvoorbeeld de publicatie 2 weken geleden van onderzoek naar sporen van slavernij en het koloniale verleden in collectieregistraties van de Rijksdienst voor het Cultureel Erfgoed. We hebben de publicatie van het boek Ongemakkelijk Erfgoed van de heer Jos van Beurden in juni gehad. Natuurlijk de opening van de grote slavernij-tentoonstelling hier in het Rijksmuseum, weer een maand eerder, dat natuurlijk ook gaat over kwesties van representatie en wat je doet met objecten in je collecties. Er zijn natuurlijk de verhitte restitutiediscussies die in het binnenland en in het buitenland en ook hier in Nederland gevoerd worden. En in januari van dit jaar, en daar werd eerder aan gerefereerd, was er natuurlijk de speciale commissie van de Raad van Cultuur onder leiding van Lilian Gonsalves Hokang New, met het rapport Koloniale Collecties en Erkenning van Onrechten, daar rechts beneden in beeld. En daar heeft u van alles al over verteld. Nou, in elk van deze recente publicaties en actuele discussies wordt eigenlijk regelmatig het belang van gedegen herkomstonderzoek naar koloniale collecties onderstreept. En de minister van OCW, Ingrid van Engelshoven, noemde in haar beleidsreactie op dat rapport van mevrouw Gonsalves Hoganyu, waar we het zo even al over hadden. Zij zei, naast incidenteel onderzoek bij verzoeken tot teruggave, is herkomstonderzoek onderaan een kerntaak van musea die essentieel is voor het aankopen, het behoud, beheer en presenteren van objecten. Maar hoe doe je dergelijk herkomstonderzoek? Welke praktische en theoretische aspecten maken herkomstonderzoek naar koloniale collecties nu anders dan andere vormen van herkomstonderzoek? Nou, om deze vragen te beantwoorden initieerde in het najaar van 2019 onderzoekers en ook conservatoren van het NIOD Instituut, het Rijksmuseum en het Nationaal Museum voor Wereldculturen, overigens ook in directe conversatie met partners in Indonesië en Sri Lanka, een pilotonderzoek met de naam PROS. Sommige mensen zeggen prootje, ik zeg eigenlijk altijd PROS en het staat voor Pilot Project Provenance Research on Objects from the Colonial Era. Nou, dit is een project, het is een hele mond vol, een project dat van iets meer dan 2 jaar en het wordt gefinancierd door het ministerie van OCW. Nou, we zijn begonnen in november 2019 en nou, een kleine vertraging ook natuurlijk door de pandemie. We verwachten de afronding in maart 2022. Nou, de deelname van het Rijksmuseum en het Nationaal Museum voor Wereldculturen, en dat omvat het Oude Tropenmuseum, Volkenkunde, Afrika Museum Berg en Dal en het Wereldmuseum van Rotterdam als samenwerkingspartner daarin. Dus de deelname van deze musea, die komt uiteraard voort uit de aard van hun collecties. En ook hun expertise op het gebied van de complexiteit van onderzoek doen naar dat soort collecties. De betrokkenheid van het NIOD, wat staat voor het Nederlands Instituut voor Oorlogsdocumentatie, hangt samen met haar ervaring in het doen van gestructureerd herkomstonderzoek, vooral op het gebied van verloren kunst in de Tweede Wereldoorlog. Oké, het doel van dit pilotproject is drieledig. Allereerst doen we ervaring op met concreet herkomstonderzoek. En daartoe hebben wij een selectie gemaakt van enkele tientallen objecten uit rijkscollecties van het Rijksmuseum en het Nationaal Museum voor Wereldculturen. Overigens allen afkomstig uit wat tegenwoordig Indonesië en Sri Lanka is. Het is een pilotonderzoek, dus we moesten ons daarin beperken. De selectie van overige objecten, of een deel van deze selectie is gemaakt door partners in Indonesië. En kwam ook voort uit eerdere gesprekken die al gevoerd waren met partners in Sri Lanka. De selectie van overige objecten hebben we bewust eigenlijk zo breed mogelijk geprobeerd te maken. Dus dat omvat archeologische kunstvoorwerpen, maar ook sieraden, wapens, vlaggen, religieuze objecten, et cetera. En we hebben ook geprobeerd daarbij gebieden uit de gehele archipel daarin op te nemen. Ook verschillende periodes daarin op te nemen. En wat ook wel belangrijk is, verschillende gradaties van reeds beschikbare voorkennis. Dus er zijn objecten bij waar we vrijwel niks over weten vooralsnog. En er zijn ook objecten bij waar al enige voorkennis over bestaat en waar we op voort kunnen borduren. Nou, door deze objecten te onderzoeken hopen we inzichtelijk te krijgen waar we in dergelijk onderzoek nou tegenaan lopen. Wat voor soort verhalen komen boven water? Welke aspecten blijven juist onderbelicht? Hoe lang duurt dergelijk onderzoek nou doorgaans? Hoe doe je nou precies verslag? Allemaal van dat soort vragen. Nou, in het vervolg hierop werken we aan een document met methodologische aanbevelingen en inzichten die kunnen dienen voor toekomstige herkomstonderzoekers. En het doel is om onze ervaringen met betrekking tot bijvoorbeeld objectonderzoek of met brongebruik of verslaglegging te vertalen naar praktische aanwijzingen voor toekomstige onderzoekers. En tegelijkertijd willen we deze onderzoekers ook vertrouwd maken met de theoretische discussies en achtergronden die spelen in dit veld. En dit alles ook met zoveel mogelijk concrete verwijzingen naar het herkomstonderzoek dat we dan zelf hebben verricht. Nou, tot slot een derde doel is het leggen van contacten met diverse belanghebbenden in dit veld. En dit betreft contacten in de museumwereld, wetenschappers en allerlei relevante organisaties die actief zijn op dit veld in Nederland en ook buiten Nederland. Denk dus bijvoorbeeld ook hier aan de KVVAK. Cruciaal is ook het contact met landen van herkomst. En vanaf het begin, al dus in het najaar van 2019, hebben we nauw contact met sleutelfiguren in de Indonesische en Sri Lankaanse museumwereld, met mensen in universiteiten, overheidsfunctionarissen. Nu met deze pandemie, we organiseren volop digitale bijeenkomsten en nemen daar ook aan deel. En bovendien zoeken we ook per object weer samenwerking met mogelijke experts in de landen van herkomst. En dat is per object natuurlijk weer verschillend wie dat dan zouden kunnen zijn. En het lijkt erop, dat is nog wel leuk om even te vertellen, het lijkt erop dat deze samenwerking ook op prijs wordt gesteld. Ik wil in dit verband even wijzen op de verantwoordelijk directeur-generaal van het Indonesische ministerie van Cultuur, de heer Hilmar Farid, die publiekelijk heeft gezegd dat gedegen herkomstonderzoek, en dat is wel aardig, dan verwijst hij ook naar ons onderzoek, een integraal onderdeel is van het denken over de toekomst van dit erfgoed. En hij zegt, it's not simply about the returning of objects, it's about knowledge production, it's about rewriting history, it's about dealing with past injustices. And, dat zegt hij ook nog, this will take many, many years to make progress. So anyone who is interested in the amount of things, in a large amount of things that are returned, might be disappointed. En het lijkt er dus ook op in de gesprekken die we hebben dan dat hij minder geïnteresseerd is in de massale terugkeer van voorwerpen naar Indonesië, zoals bijvoorbeeld met de Nusantara-collectie bijvoorbeeld gebeurd is. Hij is eigenlijk meer geïnteresseerd in het op gang brengen van een vorm van kennisuitwisseling. On an equal footing is zeer belangrijk en ook gegrond in gedegen herkomstonderzoek. Nou goed, dus hier zijn we mee bezig en concreet zal dit alles ook leiden tot de publicatie van een omvattend eindrapport in maart 2022. Met daarbij de herkomstonderzoeken naar al die objecten als een soort van stevig fundament. Goed, nou, wat houdt dat dan in? En ik wil nu graag even ingaan op 2 voorbeelden van objecten die we bestudeerd hebben of waar we nog mee bezig zijn. Beide in dit geval uit collecties van het NMVW. Het eerste object betreft een set van 6 Wayang Beber platen in de collectie van Museum Volkenkunde, NMVW Museum in Leiden. Wayang Beber is een Javaanse orale traditie die in de 14e eeuw, dus in de tijd van het roemruchte Rijk van Majapahit op Oost-Java, werd ontwikkeld. Net als bij de meer bekende Wayang Kulit-traditie en andere Wayang-tradities, bestaan Wayang Beber-opvoeringen uit avondelijke voorstellingen, waarbij een dalang oude verhalen reciteert of zingt, voordraagt, onder begeleiding van een orkest, vaak bestaand uit gamelan, een rebab en andere instrumenten. Anders dan bij Wayang Kulit, waarbij de bekende platte poppen een schaduwspel spelen, of Wayang Golek met de poppen, met de fysieke poppen, zeg maar, ontrolt de dalang in Wayang Beber lange beschilderde rollen tussen 2 houten stokken. Je ziet hieronder overigens een afbeelding hiervan van, ik meen 1904. Ja, 1902 is de afbeelding, waarin je dit ziet afgebeeld. Op die rollen zijn scènes te zien uit de verhalen over de legendarische prins Panji Asmorobangun. Hier overigens meer in detail. In de Javaanse cultuur zijn de Wayang Beber-rollen spiritueel geladen en worden ze bewaard en uitgepakt en ontrold door de dalang met inachtname van strikte voorschriften en ook offerrituelen enzovoort. Nou, in de loop van de eind 18e eeuw en de 19e eeuw leek deze traditie eigenlijk bijna uit te sterven. Maar in de laatste decennia is er weer volop aandacht voor in Indonesië. Oh, dat gaat goed. Is er weer volop aandacht voor en worden er ook weer jonge dalang opgeleid en ook nieuwe rollen weer vervaardigd. Er zijn evenwel nog maar 2 bekende oude Wayang Beber sets bekend ook bij experts. Namelijk in de dorpen Gedompel en Gelaran. Slechts weinige experts lijken er ook van op de hoogte dat er nog een 3e oude set bestaat. Namelijk de set in het Museum Volkenkunde. En het is dus ook niet verwonderlijk dat onze Indonesische partners hier ook graag meer over wilden weten. Nou, bij dergelijk onderzoek beginnen we uiteraard gewoon met de informatie die reeds in museumsystemen te vinden is. Dus bijvoorbeeld hier een inventariskaart bijgepakt. En op die inventariskaart kun je bijvoorbeeld al zien dat deze set onderdeel was van de collectie van het Koninklijk Kabinet van Zeldzaamheden. Dat zie je als je mijn schaduw volgt hier. Dit koninklijk kabinet was opgericht in 1816 door koning Willem I om de oude stadhoudelijke collectie in te herbergen. Enkele decennia later werd de KKZ, de afkorting, werd opgeheven en kwamen de meeste etnografische objecten terecht in het Rijksetnografisch Museum, een voorloper van Museum Volkenkunde. Uit het archief van het Rijksmuseum voor Oudheden, dus weer een ander museum, en van het KKZ is gebleken dat de rollen op 2 maart 1852 bij het KKZ binnenkwamen. Nadat ze eerst naar het archeologisch kabinet der Hogeschool waren gestuurd. Het archeologisch kabinet van de Hogeschool is een van de voorlopers dus van het Museum voor Oudheden, dus vandaar dat we het archief daar vonden. De toenmalige directeur van het archeologisch kabinet, Konrad Leemans, kreeg deze rollen in november 1851 van ene Adolphe François Henri van de Poel of van der Poel. Beide varianten zien we terugkeren. En dat was een assistent-resident in Kebumen op Java. Van der Poel, die tussen 1840 en 1873 een ambtelijke carrière doorliep in het koloniale bestuursapparaat, die zou uiteindelijk ook zijn carrière eindigen als resident in Semarang, dus een vrij hoge positie. Hij zond regelmatig etnografische en archeologische objecten naar Nederland. En dan weer met name naar het archeologisch kabinet van Leemans. Hij werd hiervoor ook onderscheiden met een benoeming tot ridder in de orde van de Nederlandse leeuw. Hij legde ook zelf een verzameling aan, een privécollectie, en gaf ook objecten persoonlijk in eigendom van Leemans. Dus hij gaf ze aan het museum, maar ook aan Leemans persoonlijk. Nou, het is helaas lang niet altijd helder waar Van der Poel zijn objecten dan weer vandaan haalde. Maar met betrekking tot de Waing Berber-rollen was met name Leemans geïnteresseerd in de precieze herkomst daarvan. Omdat hij wilde weten of de traditie van Waing Berber nou een levende traditie was, dat ze nog steeds op Java werd uitgevoerd. En dan in dat geval dus thuis hoorde bij het KKZ. Of dat het een traditie was die al was verdwenen, die al was uitgestorven en die we dus als antiquiteit zouden moeten beschouwen. En in dat geval zou het dan een plaats verdienen in zijn eigen archeologisch kabinet. Nou, het is wellicht hierom dat we iets meer weten van de herkomst van deze Waing Berber-rollen. Want in een notitie van Leemans, die we hebben kunnen traceren in het KKZ-archief, wordt Van der Poel als volgt geciteerd. Van der Poel zegt: "Ik heb onlangs in de Desa Sampang van het huis van de bewaker des Pamambahan Sampang, dat is Panembahang waarschijnlijk, een stel in pisang, blad, gewikkelde en op papier van boombast getekende wayang gevonden, waarvan de kleuren, zo ook de tekeningen, kenmerken dragen van de kunst die weleer op Java bestond." Nou, overigens nog een ander archiefstuk zagen we dat Leemans zei dat Van der Poel de rollen gevonden en in eigendom verkregen had. Ik ben natuurlijk meteen op zoek gegaan naar dit dorp en ik meen het gevonden te hebben hier op een kaart van 1855. Het rondje linksbovenin op de kaart. En tegenwoordig bestaat dat dorp ook nog. Hier zien we een kaart van Google Maps waar dat dorp staat aangegeven. Nou, helaas is het moeilijk om te zeggen hoe we in eigendom verkregen en gevonden nou precies moeten begrijpen. Was het inderdaad een in onbruik geraakte traditie, zoals sommige contemporaine Nederlandse indologen, zoals bijvoorbeeld Wilkens in die tijd beweerden? Nee, er waren andere indologen, zoals Pijnappel en Roorda, die inschatten dat de Waing Berber-traditie tot de toenmalige tegenwoordige tijd behoorde. Interessant in dit geval is dat de doorslag werd gegeven door een Javaanse bediende, die niet verder met naam wordt genoemd, die Leemans wist te vertellen dat hij zelf op Java dergelijke uitvoeringen had bijgewoond. Nou, daarmee was het pleit beslecht en gingen de stukken dus naar het KKZ. Een andere vraag was, hoe oud waren deze rollen nu eigenlijk? Pijnappel beweerde dat de rollen recente creaties waren. Maar inmiddels hebben Saiful Bahri, Isamu Sakamoto en Muhammad Nurul Fashri met behulp van radiokoolstofanalyse vastgesteld dat het papier van deze rollen in Museum Volkenkunde ergens tussen 1633 en 1669 is gemaakt, dus 17e eeuws. En daarmee hebben we inderdaad te maken met een vergelijkbare set rollen als de rollen in Galaran en Gedompol. En daarvan wordt vermoed dat ze ergens gemaakt zijn aan het Hof van Mataram en in de context van alle politieke strubbelingen naar omliggende dorpen verdwenen zijn, of daar nog steeds zijn. Nou, tot slot nog de vraag, hadden ze halverwege de 19e eeuw dezelfde grote spirituele waarde die er vandaag de dag aan wordt gehecht? En ja, ook dat is natuurlijk moeilijk vast te stellen, maar we krijgen wel een indicatie dat toen Hazeu in 1902, dus 50 jaar later, probeerde de rollen van Galaran op te kopen, dat onder geen beding mogelijk was en ook onder geen enkele prijs. Dus het geeft wel aan dat in ieder geval rond 1902, in de tijd van die foto die we net zagen, dat niet kon. Oké, ik wil nu graag naar een tweede object. En dat is een leeuwtje van ongeveer 30 centimeter hoog, gemaakt van vulkanisch gesteente, vandaag de dag in de collectie van het Tropenmuseum, het NMVW. Dit leeuwtje maakt onderdeel uit van de zogenaamde Tilman-collectie. En Georg Tilman was een Duitse, Joodse bankier en kunstverzamelaar die in 1931 uitweek naar Amsterdam, op de vlucht voor antisemitisme. In Nederland zette hij zijn activiteiten als verzamelaar voort en begon zich ook te interesseren voor etnografica en niet-westerse oudheden, vooral uit Nederlands-Indië. En zo legde hij een aanzienlijke collectie aan van objecten, met name textielen, maar ook krissen, juwelen, ook hindoe-boeddhistische oudheden. Een aantal jaar later, in november 1939, plaatste Georg Tilman de gehele collectie in bruikleen van het Koloniaal Instituut, wat het Tropenmuseum, zo heette het Tropenmuseum toen. Hij zelf moest natuurlijk vluchten voor de nazi's die op dat moment aan de macht waren. Nou, hij overleed uiteindelijk in 1941 in de VS ten gevolge van een ziekte. Maar zijn collectie van ruim 2000 stukken werd in kisten verpakt, eigenlijk opgeborgen in de museumcollectie van het Koloniaal Instituut en doorstond op die manier de bezettingstijd zonder schade. Tilman hield ook een professionele collectieregistratie bij en hij vermeldt op zijn eigen collectiekaarten, die ik hier heb weergegeven, dat het leeuwtje, waarschijnlijk uitgehakt uit een makkara, daar kom ik zo op, vroeger in bezit is geweest van de Vereniging der Vrienden der Aziatische Kunst in Amsterdam. We zien ook Van Lier 36, daar onderaan de bovenste afbeelding. En dat duidt erop dat hij het beeldje in 1936 van de kunstzaal Van Lier verkocht. En ook hierbij, de kunstverzamelaar Karel van Lier was net als Tilman van Joodse komaf. In dit geval, hij werd gedwongen in de Tweede Wereldoorlog om zijn kunsthandel af te staan. Hij was actief ook in het verzet, werd gedeporteerd en hij werd vermoord in een subkamp van Neuengamme in 1945. Nou, dit soort geschiedenissen die op zich niet in directe zin in relatie staan tot dit beeldje, herinneren ons wel aan het feit dat objecten voor een hele verscheidenheid aan personen en in vele contexten een betekenis kunnen hebben gehad. Nou, het onderzoek naar de exacte weg waarlangs dit beeldje in bezit is gekomen van Tilman is nog steeds in volle gang. En hiervoor zijn we onder andere aan het zoeken in de archieven van Lier en ook van het KVVAK. Duidelijk is in ieder geval wel dat het beeldje wordt vermeld in het jaarverslag van de KVVAK in 1923-24 als recente aankoop. Mogelijk gemaakt met geld van ene Abraham Cappadose, een president van een oliemaatschappij in Nederlands-Indië. En daarmee behoorde het beeldje dus tot een van de vroegste eigen collectie van de KVVAK. Nou, zonder nadere documentatie over de aankoop van de KVVAK is het vooralsnog niet mogelijk de herkomst van het beeldje nou nader te traceren in Nederlands-Indië. En ook een nadere specificatie op basis van uiterlijke objectkenmerken is niet eenvoudig mogelijk. Getuigen ook het eerdere werk van William Southworth en Marijke Klokke op dit gebied, naar vergelijkbare objecten. Wel is het mogelijk om op basis van de contemporaine westerse literatuur over dergelijke beeldjes helder te krijgen welke betekenis westerse archeologen en indologen nou hechten aan dergelijke beeldjes. Zoals we al op de collectiekaart van Tilman konden lezen, werd vermoed dat dit leeuwtje oorspronkelijk in de opengesperde bek van een makkara moet hebben gezeten. En een makkara is een mythologisch zeewezen dat in Zuid- en Zuidoost-Azië vaak werd verwerkt in bouwwerken en ornamenten. Links onderaan zien we een voorbeeld en ook hier aan beide zijden van de poort. In de Indonesische archipel kreeg dit zeewezen bovendien vaak een olifantskop, met in de opengesperde bek een mensfiguur of een dier, vaak ook een leeuwtje. En als zodanig sieren dergelijke makkara de trapleuningen, de poorten en de deurposten van oude hindoe-boeddhistische tempels, zoals bijvoorbeeld de Borobudur, dat alleen al honderden van dergelijke makkara telt. En uiteindelijk zijn veel van deze makkara ook in westerse museumcollecties terechtgekomen. Nou, de iconografie van deze makkara met olifantskop en opengesperde bek, die was belangrijk voor 20e eeuwse westerse wetenschappers. Want al vanaf de 19e eeuw waren zij bezig geweest met het reconstrueren van de ontwikkeling en ook de verspreiding van culturen en beschavingen over de wereldbol en ook door de tijd heen. En dat deden ze met een vergelijkende methode en in die vergelijkende methode waren ze erachter gekomen dat de makkara met olifantskop een van de bouwkundige details was die Javaanse hindoe-boeddhistische bouwwerken onderscheiden van hindoe-boeddhistische bouwwerken in Zuid-Azië en continentaal Zuidoost-Azië, dus Myanmar en Thailand enzovoort. Bovendien waren makkara specifiek voor de vroege klassieke periode op Java en leken ze vrijwel volledig te ontbreken op latere hindoe-boeddhistische bouwwerken op Java. Dat wil zeggen bouwwerken van na de 10e eeuw na Christus. Dus in die zin waren makkara met de olifantskop en met eventueel een leeuwtje in de opengesperde bek, waren markers van vroege hindoe-boeddhistische beschaving op Java en waren het dus ook waard om verzameld te worden. Nou, als we dit hele verhaal vertellen, dan begrijpen we ook dat de eigentijdse wijze van verwerving en ook de betekenis die er eventueel werd gehecht aan dergelijke objecten door Indonesiërs bijvoorbeeld, er op dat moment eigenlijk vrij weinig toe deden voor de verzamelaars. Goed, enkele afsluitende observaties. Zo zie je dat 2 objectgeschiedenissen eigenlijk een veelheid aan verhalen en aspecten aanraken en naar boven halen over de Indonesische cultuurgeschiedenis, over de Nederlandse koloniale geschiedenis en de geschiedenis van museale collecties. En ter afsluiting wil ik nog enkele algemene observaties met u delen. Nou, allereerst, door de inherent koloniale aard feitelijk van ons bronnenmateriaal, is het dikwijls ingewikkeld verder terug te gaan in de tijd dan het moment dat de objecten in Europa arriveerden. We kunnen vaak nog wel 1 stap terugzetten van wat gebeurde er dan in Nederlands-Indië, maar veel verder lukt regelmatig niet. Toch komen we met sommige voorwerpen heel ver en over het algemeen kunnen we wel zeggen dat we altijd meer kennis weten toe te voegen aan een object dan tot dan toe bekend. Het is eigenlijk nooit zo dat we helemaal meteen kunnen ophouden met het onderzoek. Nader onderzoek met Indonesische wayang-experts en bijvoorbeeld de hedendaagse dalang van Bagelen Kebumen in Midden-Java zou kunnen helpen om onze kennis over de wayang beber bijvoorbeeld verder aan te scherpen en te verdiepen. Ten tweede leren dergelijke geschiedenissen ons veel eigenlijk over de werking van koloniale kennissystemen, waarbij bepaalde informatie werd verheven tot westers geaccepteerde academische wetenschap en andere informatie naar de achtergrond verdween of juist werd weggedrukt. Een zinsnede met betrekking tot de wayang beber bijvoorbeeld als gevonden en in eigendom verkregen, verhult op deze manier vrij duidelijk de manier waarop iets verkregen is. En hoogdravende kennis over de geografische verspreiding van hindoe-boeddhistische beschavingen verdringt informatie over de eigentijdse betekenis van dergelijke voorwerpen in Nederlands-Indië en de rol die verschillende mensen daarin speelden. Ten derde blijkt uit deze 2 voorbeelden dat herkomstonderzoek uiteindelijk specialistisch werk is, waarbij veel verschillende bronnen, ook veel verschillende soorten bronnen en ook op veel verschillende bewaarplaatsen geraadpleegd en gewogen dienen te worden. Het gaat dan niet alleen om de museumsystemen, maar ook om archieven elders. Dus voor ons onderzoek naar de wayang beber en naar het leeuwtje raadpleegden we archieven van het Rijksmuseum, en dan met name van het KKZ dat in Haarlem ligt, het VVAK-archief, het RKD voor informatie over Van Lier, het Tropenmuseum voor informatie over Tilman, het Nationaal Archief voor informatie over Van der Poel. Dan hebben we nog het Museum voor Oudheden, dat ik al eerder noemde. En natuurlijk ook correspondentie met experts in Japan, Indonesië, in Nederland. Dus dat gaat eigenlijk vrij ver. Een vierde punt, en daarmee wil ik afsluiten, is dat ook de hulp van private eigenaars voor ons van groot belang is. Kijk, historisch gezien is een strikt onderscheid tussen institutionele eigenaars, wier collecties uiteindelijk in handen kwamen van de staat, en private eigenaars die hun objecten bijvoorbeeld onderbrachten in verenigingen zoals de KVVK. Die historisch gezien is dat onderscheid soms moeilijk te maken. Om een voorbeeld te geven, Van der Poel doneerde aan Leemans, ik noemde het al zo even, doneerde aan Leemans in zijn hoedanigheid als directeur van het archeologisch kabinet, maar ook in zijn hoedanigheid als private verzamelaar en eigenlijk als vriend. Zelfs als objecten uiteindelijk in staatseigendom belanden, waren ze dikwijls in eerdere periodes in handen van private handelaars en verzamelaars, zoals bijvoorbeeld zichtbaar is bij het leeuwtje van de KVVK en Tilman. En dan heb je ook nog dat objecten die bijvoorbeeld in Nederlands-Indië uit eenzelfde vindt plaats, of eenzelfde collectiestammen, dat die langs verschillende routes uiteindelijk in Nederland in verschillende collecties terecht zijn gekomen, maar wel onderling geschiedenissen hebben die aan elkaar complementair zijn. Nou, in het kader van kennisverwerving zijn de expertise van private eigenaars en de archieven en de documentatie die zij mogelijk nog bezitten, eigenlijk voor ons van groot belang. En het is ook daarom dat we dankbaar zijn dat het bestuur van de KVVAK ons de mogelijkheid heeft gegeven in hun archief te zoeken en ons bovendien uitnodigde vandaag iets te vertellen over ons onderzoek. En met deze algemene observaties wil ik afsluiten en u hartelijk danken. Oké, dank je.
Dankjewel, Klaas. Dat is heel boeiend. De diepgang van het onderzoek en de hordes die je moet nemen. En de grenzen natuurlijk ook daaraan, die heb je heel goed duidelijk gemaakt. En het is heel spannend. We gaan verder zien wat er uitkomt. En bij de Q&A vanmiddag kunnen er ook vragen over het onderzoek verder worden gesteld. Hartelijk dank daarvoor. I may now introduce Alexandra Green. Alexandra is the Henry Ginsberg Curator for Southeast Asia from the British Museum. Alexandra has a PhD on the subject of 18th century Burmese wall paintings from the School of Oriental and African Studies of the University of London. We are honored to have Alexandra Green as a speaker on our symposium on the subject of the Sir Stamford Raffles Collections from Java. Some of you may not know it, but the British Museum houses more than 2,000 objects collected by Raffles on Java from 1811 to 1815. Our lecture was earlier planned, but due to the COVID situation, we had to postpone it, and it wonderfully fits in our symposium today. Alexandra, I leave the floor to you. Referent will be William Southworth, Conservator Zuidoost-Azië. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much for the kind introduction, and I hope everybody can hear me. It's a pleasure to be here. I love Amsterdam, and it's also just wonderful to be out of my house. And I want to say thank you very much to Renee, and I'm going to mispronounce your name, Steenbergen, apologies, and also the Royal Society of Asian Art for the invitation to come. And this was the 4th time that we've arranged for me to come. So I'm very happy to be here. I do think it's a little bit amusing that we are talking about Raffles in a workshop on provenance, because part of the problem with the Raffles collection is that we have almost no provenance for this material, in part because there's very little about it in his writings. These things simply weren't important 200 years ago, the idea of where you acquired something, but also, of course, because of the great tragedy, one of the many tragedies in his life, where his ship sank in 1824 as he was leaving Southeast Asia for the last time. So, there. So, Thomas Stamford Raffles was born on board a ship near Jamaica in July 1781. The family was of modest means, and he began work as a clerk at the East India Company at age 14. In 1805, he traveled to Penang in Southeast Asia as assistant secretary to the governor. Raffles contributed substantially to the expedition against Java in 1811, and his patron, Lord Minto, established him as lieutenant governor of the island. And that was a position he held technically until 1815, but actually he didn't depart the island until 1816, because although the decision was made in Europe in 1815, given no mobile phones in those days, it took a while for him to receive the information. So while on Java, Raffles had become very determined that it should be kept as a British colony in order to establish free trade ports in the British trade between India and China. With the return of Java in 1816, the Dutch resumed control of considerable territory in Southeast Asia. And so once Raffles returned to Southeast Asia from Europe in 1818 as lieutenant governor of Bengkulu on Sumatra, his search for a site for free and unrestricted commerce continued. He entered into an agreement with a local ruling family in February 1819 to establish a British port in Singapore. The East India Company actually was extremely unhappy with this because of the diplomatic conflicts it caused with the Dutch. Nor were they particularly happy with Raffles' financial administration of Java and Bengkulu, which were both loss-making ventures. In 1824, when Raffles returned to Britain for the last time, in 1826, the company demanded that he repay £22,272 for costs incurred, which of course was a vast sum at the time. If you think that some people, now are working at the British Museum for £23,000 a year, you can imagine 200 years ago it was a great deal of money. Raffles actually died less than 2 months after this bill arrived, at the age of 44, of a condition that's, I'm not sure of the name, I can't remember the name, but it was a malformation of the blood vessels in his brain. Anyway, the British Museum holds more than 2,000 objects associated with Raffles. The majority, about 1,500, are from Java, primarily collected during the time when he was lieutenant governor, between 1811 and 1816. A further 500 are Chinese coins, which were also found on Java, and the remainder includes items from Sumatra, Nias, India, Burma, Myanmar, and Siam, or Thailand. These arrived at the museum in two bodies of material, one in 1859 upon the death of his widow, and then a second in 1939 from his so the first tranche arrived, was given by the executor of Raffles, Lady Raffles' estate, who was also Raffles' nephew, and then the granddaughter of the nephew gave more material in 1939. And I think we can see very much in Raffles' collection a real development of ideas of museums in Europe over this period of time. So, and you'll notice, not here, but on some of the objects, if you look at the numbers, you can see the first number will give you the year that it entered the collection. And the theatrical materials, the coins, the sculptures came in 1859, but the drawings, which had been pasted into books, which had been written on, were very much considered unimportant. They were simply basic records. So they didn't actually arrive until 1939, when this, again, changes in concepts of what should be in a museum and what was actually valuable had changed. And actually, it was quite interesting in that the coins all came in 1859, but we didn't bother to register them until 1908. So that's another thing to be explored. So these objects, though, are just part of what Raffles collected during his many years in Asia. There are also 80 Malay manuscripts and 45 Javanese ones in the Royal Asiatic Society. There's a group of Gamalan instruments in Claydon House in Buckinghamshire. There are Chris ritual daggers in the Royal Collection Trust, and more than 100 natural history drawings at the British Library. These are just some of the objects, some of the reasons why Raffles was out there. He was out there for trade, and I will come back to that later on. But opium was very important, the ceramic trade was important, and of course, spices were very important. But here are some of the manuscripts that are in the Royal Asiatic Society, and apparently only two of these came from Yogyakarta. The big assumption, of course, with Raffles' collection is that he had ordered the attack on the court of Yogyakarta in 1812. And again, this is something we're working on. The assumption is that his whole collection was looted from the court at that time. But as research has been ongoing, it seems to be less and less likely that the majority, or even more than a very small part of his collection, actually came from Jogja. So only two, apparently, of these manuscripts came from the court at Jogja. And then these, of course, are some of the lovely natural history drawings that he collected and commissioned while he was on Java. While he was on Sumatra. But we actually have customs and excise lists from 1816 that demonstrate there was much more in his collection, including objects from Japan, gold ornaments from Java, lacquer, ceramic, textiles, and so forth. And we also have some records of what Raffles lost when the ship that was to take him back to Britain in 1824 burned and sank 50 miles off the coast of Sumatra in February 1824. The collections on the Fame included diamonds from the court of Jogja, gold, textile examples for British manufacturers, weapons, and quote-unquote curiosities. There were also numerous ancient Malay manuscripts, books, dictionaries and grammars of regional languages, live animals, especially trained for the voyage to Europe, botanical samples, and more than 2,000 natural history drawings. These also sank. And he also had lots of paperwork regarding his administrative posts and the notes and materials to write further histories of the region. He was going to write also a history of Sumatra, a history of Sulawesi, and a history of Singapore. In the 2-month interval until another ship arrived, he collected material again and commissioned as many new natural history drawings as possible, but really the destruction of his materials and papers made it impossible for him to continue as a scholar of Southeast Asia. And of course, it also has hampered our research into the provenance of his collection because his papers were lost. But I think we can still uncover many things about his collections. Why did he collect what he did? Why do his collections from Java have the shape that they do? And I would like to argue that we can start to answer these questions by understanding his writings. So this is his 2-volume work, History of Java, that was published in 1817. So in this book, he draws upon his own writings as well as other people's writings, and he collates as much information as possible about the island. So he discusses everything: geography, climate, flora and fauna, population, foreign settlers, history, agriculture, manufacturing, the origin of the Javanese people and their character. He talks about clothing, he talks about commerce, cultural activities from the court and the village. He talks about the theater, he talks about other contemporary arts, weaponry, language, religion, literature, vocabularies, astrology, and antiquities. So a lot of this, there's a huge amount of information, and some of it is still useful even today. He produced the volumes very rapidly between mid-1816 and early 1817. He had returned to London after his governorship on Java for health reasons, and he dedicates the volumes to the Prince Regent, the future King George IV, who was very pleased, and he knighted Raffles in May 1817. Both the collection and his publication can be understood as part of Raffles' zeal to bring the advantages of what he considered to be civilization to the world beyond Britain. He was a committed imperialist. He believed strongly in the establishment of colonies for British interests and for the betterment of the colonized people, in his opinion, of course. Sorry, I'm going to be making lots of comments that obviously are unacceptable today, but which were standard in those days. He was very keen to relieve the Javanese of a despotic government, and he wanted to bring them into contact, the Javanese into contact with a superior civilization so that the Javanese could be brought up to what he considered to be an appropriate standard. So in his History of Java, Raffles actually argues that the Javanese were relatively civilized. They had the potential to benefit from colonial rule. And this really was in keeping with European Enlightenment concepts of civilization, where human societies were ranked on a scale. You had the savages down at the bottom, and then, of course, you had the British up at the top. And so everybody was arranged in this line. The assumption was that British civilization was superior to all others, but people could be improved with assistance from people more civilized than themselves. So my argument is basically that Raffles' collection pulls together what he considered to be the most refined aspects of Javanese culture. But of course, his ideas that the Javanese were relatively advanced, he wanted to say that because they're relatively advanced, the British should colonize them because they'll be easy to pull up to a high standard. And of course, these standards were based on European ideas. So you had a high level of civilization if you had writing, if you had national history in the European empirical sense. Music was also important. Monumental, particularly stone architecture, was important. Commercial enterprise, free trade was important. And of course, you had to have what he considered to be a progressive form of government. Raffles also followed contemporary scientific trends, collecting sets of objects instead of individual examples. He was one of the first people to apply the Enlightenment notion of systematic scientific collecting to cultural material. However, these groups of objects were not systematic by Javanese standards, indicating his incomplete understanding of local culture. And omissions, so then if we also look at his collection, what was left out? And these provide us insights both into economic priorities as well as to religious prejudices. So he gave his few textiles to British manufacturers to copy, to improve, so they could copy the designs and resell them back out in Asia. Although in Java, the designs and the textiles, of course, were very important in terms of marking your rank and status. To European society, patterns were not particularly important. And this is also evident in Raffles' writings, where he talks a lot about the cut of the cloth as opposed to the patterns. But of course, on Java, it was the patterns that were important, not the cut of the cloth. But in Europe, the cut was important. So anyway, so these were markers of trade. So he gave them and he didn't collect them. We only have 2 Javanese textiles from Raffles in the British Museum. The other thing that Raffles did not collect was Muslim material, despite the fact that the Javanese at the time he was there were predominantly Muslim. Like many of the Europeans of the time, he viewed Islam negatively, and he thought it brought about a decline in civilization. So it really wasn't a good thing that the Javanese were now Muslim. So with the remainder of Raffles' Javanese collections, I divide them into 4 main groups: those associated with rank and status in European minds, the Hindu-Buddhist material, the Javanese theatrical objects, and then I turn at the very end for the small body material that connects with profit. So I'm going to look at sort of the reasons behind the collection of each group in turn, and I'll comment on the provenance work that we've been doing. In their writings about Java, Europeans often mentioned clothing and accoutrements that indicated rank and status or were valuable in their own eyes. Diamond buttons, gold jewelry, these sorts of things come up frequently. Yet we don't have a lot of items like that in Raffles' collections. There are no gold or silver objects collected by Raffles in the British Museum, the British Library, or the Royal Asiatic Society, and the location of the Javanese woman's ornaments mentioned in the 1816 customs lists is now unknown. In the Royal Collection Trust, however, there are 7 kris daggers and sheaths, 1 sword and scabbard, and a spear, all with elaborate designs in gold, silver, and gems. And actually, they're there because in 1817, Raffles gave them to the Prince Regent, who was a weapons enthusiast. And although the 16 krises in the British Museum are mostly well-made and handsome, they are not as indicative of wealth and status according to European standards. The fact that Raffles kept the quote-unquote lesser kris and gifted his gold and gem-encrusted examples suggests that the latter were viewed as a means to promote himself. Large numbers of visitors did come to see his collections. He became acquainted with important members of the European scholarly world because of his collections. But for some objects, I would argue monetary worth was of primary importance. Coupled with the value of the exotic, they were relevant in the European context as status-enhancing possessions and gifts. They were an important part of social and political interactions at the time. The worth of the objects meant that they were collected to be gifted, as opposed to forming part of a larger collection and discussion, and therefore they're not at the British Museum. So basically, objects that were particularly valuable were there to promote him. we turn to Raffles' Hindu-Buddhist material, Raffles collected and commissioned drawings and plans of Java's ancient Hindu and Buddhist sites and sculpture. So there are more than 350 works on paper in Raffles' collection at the British Museum, and they display several different formats. Some are hasty sketches in pencil, they're also detailed two-scale diagrams, and they're picturesque reconstructions. Some of these images recorded material systematically. However, many of the illustrations bear little resemblance to actual monuments and sculpture. But they did appeal to European tastes at the time for romantic ruins and exotic objects. Most of the architectural drawings featured in the history of Java were produced in this picturesque style, displaying ruined buildings partially covered with vegetation and located in a deserted landscape in order to popularize the book. So, I mean, the drawings have been particularly interesting. There's some also in the Royal Asiatic Society, there's some in the British Library, and some of them were drawn by people who worked for Raffles, such as G.P. Baker, but we do have a number of drawings, many drawings actually, by Dutch, like this one. This was by Vardenaar. We also have some by H.C. Cornelius. And we don't know how those were acquired by Raffles. And actually, many of the drawings don't have any names at all. And we've started looking at comparing the different collections, and we've managed to identify some additional, we're able to say this one in this collection says it's by Baker. So then now we know that this one in our collection, which had no signature, is now also by Baker. So we've been working on that. And actually, I should also say that the British Museum's collections are entirely online. So if you go to our collections online and you simply put in Thomas Stamford Raffles, you will come up with all the objects. And in each object, we have put the provenance research that we have been doing. But we don't know where Raffles got them. And we have them pasted into these very large books. And in the research that I've been doing, I think the books were actually put together after Raffles' death. In 1827 by Baker, who had returned from Asia and was helping Lady Raffles deal with all the materials that Raffles had left. And I think he's the one who made these books because he's written all over them lots of useful comments, but then also personal opinions. So they're quite interesting. Anyway, to get back to this, so we have picturesque drawings like this, and I'm just going to show you a series of images to give you a sense of the different types of drawings and watercolors that we have. So we have basically record drawings like this, where they're trying to show the layout of the temple, the cross-section of the temple. But of course, the temples were in ruins, and so then a lot of these actually were fanciful reconstructions, what the Europeans thought the buildings must have looked like when they were new. And I will say that Cornelius was particularly bad about this, and Baker had very strong opinions about Cornelius's work, and on many of the drawings he's written rubbish, or this is nonsense, or this is completely invented. So it's quite amusing. And you'll see that a number of the drawings do actually have English and Dutch, or sometimes just Dutch inscriptions. And we have fantastic images like this. This is huge. It's more than 1.5 meters long of Borobudur. So you get a very, very good indication of how things were viewed. But again, Raffles had Borobudur cleared, and we have gone around and we've looked at, in 2018, I went around and I was able to identify where all the buildings, all the drawings were of, what all those buildings of the drawings were of, as well as I was able to identify where the details, the reliefs were from. So that was very, very useful. And again, this is all material you can look at online. We also have quite a few drawings like this by Baker, where he used this grid paper to try and provide an accurate representation of the images. We also have lots of sketchy little things like this. And one thing that's quite interesting about the collection is that there's not much from East Java, but there's a great deal from Central Java. And again, I think this has to do with where the British were based. So you had British residents in Central Java. You had, of course, the main courts were in Central Java, so that's where all the colonial diplomatic activity was taking place. Very little happened out in East Java of that nature, so we don't have very much material from that area. We also have these fanciful but very careful pen and ink drawings. And as I said, although they look quite European-ish, we were able to identify all the reliefs that these were from, on Borobudur particularly. And what was quite interesting is that most of them are on either side of the staircases. So they didn't get further around, probably because of the damage to the site. And then you have lovely things like this, and of course this is in the museum in Leiden. And I must say, in the middle of my talk, I must say thank you very much to William and Pim Westerkamp and Pauline Lunsing-Schurlier and of course Anna Slauska for their help in looking at these drawings and connecting them with Dutch collections. So again, that's been part of the work that we've been doing. And then, of course, here you have the fanciful reconstructions. And you'll see in the middle there, in Baker's handwriting, it says pure imagination or invention. So this is supposedly what it looked like covered in vegetation, and then that's what it must have looked like, according to Cornelius, when it was new. And then you have, again, images like this that tie in very strongly with European conceptions of the picturesque. But many images also show that the Europeans really didn't know what they were looking at. They really didn't understand it. So they had to reset Javanese material into European visual conventions that created these hybrid images that rendered the Javan civilization exotic and exciting, but not too alien. If it's so disconnected from what you understand, you won't know what you're looking at. But if we kind of, in the process of redrawing these things, if we make them just a little bit more closely connected with European conventions, then of course it becomes much more exciting and understandable. So then they had as I said, they had these difficulties where you have, that's the image that's then being drawn here, and you can see how they really haven't been able to draw it properly. And things like this, where you do have lots of images in Java of Surya, the Sun King in his, sorry, not the Sun King, the Sun God in his chariot, but that chariot is definitely European style, and so are the horses. So one of the other things that we have been doing is taking all these very odd-looking drawings and trying to figure out where the sculptures are located. And we've managed to we've identified all the architectural material, but we've only identified about a third of the sculptures, in part because some of them are so bizarrely drawn that we haven't been able to connect them with anything specific. One of the things that excited the Europeans is associations with other cultures. So when they found when they found buildings like Candi Suku, which of course is a pyramid, then they were particularly excited because they connected it immediately with Egypt, and they decided that the Egyptians must have colonized Java at one point. Of course, for things like Borobudur and Prambanan, those obviously had been produced by the Indians. So this actually was also turned into a political thing because, of course, if the Javanese were producing stone monuments under previous colonial enterprises, and now, of course, they were only building in wood, they had obviously declined once those colonizers had left. This was an argument to bring the British in because they would be able to bring the Javanese back up to that high standard once again. So this decline could be reversed, and under new colonialism, the Javanese would reach great heights. Again, they could be re-civilized. But of course, other than these drawings of stone objects, Raffles collected little stone material. And I think a factor that's not oftentimes considered in collecting is the ease of transport. You know, in those days, it could be 6 months to get from Java back to Europe. And I would say that the collection of drawings is balanced by a series of small, lightweight metal objects. And so basically things that were big and heavy, he collected drawings of, and things that were smaller and lighter, then he collected more of those. So he took a few stone sculptures. We have 3 heads from Borobudur, and you'll see these came in 1859. We have another small Kinari from the Prambanan area, and we have this sculpture of Mamaki from Chandi Jago in the collection. Again, these are small. One person can pick them up. So again, he sent a few large pieces abroad, but those were gifts. But for himself, he kept the small pieces, again, because he was transporting things personally back to Europe. He also collected, as I said, so the images that we have a lot of are small bronze images, and we have very few. We only have 3 drawings of bronze images. But so because he could collect the objects, there was no need for drawings of them. But then the 3 drawings, and again, I must credit Pauline very much for this, these 3 drawings are actually sculptures that were in a private collection during Raffles' time, so he couldn't collect them. So then he had them drawn. And I sometimes wonder if he didn't do these drawings because they're clearly the worst drawings that we have in the entire collection. But we have many, many of these. So we have more than 100 small metal objects. And as I said, we only had 3 drawings of metal objects. But like his other collections, the metal sculptures do not represent a broad survey, and they consist mostly of examples from early time periods. Some deities are heavily represented, such as the Buddha Akshobhya. We have 9 examples. We also have quite a number of bodhisattvas. Others are not represented at all, such as the Hindu deity Shiva. Raffles, of course, didn't know much about any of these. He boasted that he had a complete set of Hindu figures, despite the fact that actually the majority are Buddhist. So this, again, demonstrates his lack of understanding. So this is an image of the Buddha Amitabha. This is an image of the Buddha Vairajana, of the Bodhisattva Manjushri. And we have, as I said, almost no Hindu images, and this is one of the few, an image of Ganesha. And we do have a little bit of information about how Raffles collected these. In his book, he mentions that once the Javanese knew that he was interested in these pieces, then people brought them to the resident of the Kedu region in central Java. So the Javanese were actually bringing them to the British. So these images stopped being produced about 1500 as Islam spread across Java, but the Javanese began making metal figures again in the late 1700s or early 1800s as they became aware of European interest. However, the now Muslim Javanese did not know Hindu-Buddhist iconography, and the figures draw upon contemporary imagery such as clown figures and sculptors' imaginations. So we have here a figure under a tree, which is extremely odd. And we have here a figure on a throne, and around the sides of the throne are images of the clown figures that are now so well associated with shadow theater. We have more than 20 such pieces. Of course, Raffles collected them because he didn't know much about Hinduism and Buddhism, so he assumed that they were genuine. But it's interesting, though, that he did not publish these in his History of Java. And he did have an Indian Hindu advisor, so maybe this advisor didn't know what they were, so Raffles didn't put them into his book. Okay, turning to the theatrical collections. So Raffles' theatrical collections are particularly substantial, comprising more than 360 shadow puppets, 44 flat wooden puppets, Wyanklittic, 46 three-dimensional puppets, Wyankruchil Gillig, 130 masks, and over 55 full-sized and model Gamalan instruments. And again, part of what we have been doing is trying to figure out where these things came from. Again, the assumption has been that these were all looted from the court at Yogyakarta, but it actually, again, we're just at the beginning. Some of the research had to be paused because of COVID. I'm trying to get academics from Indonesia to come and work with me, going through each object in the collection to look at it stylistically and possibly push our understanding of Javanese theater back even further. But the masks appear primarily to be from Central Java, though there are some examples from Cirebon and possibly Eastern Java. And Rudi Wiratama and Bima Raharjo of Gajah Mada University have been particularly helpful with these identifications, but obviously it needs further research. Although the images also look old now, I think it's quite possible that many of these are unused. Certainly the masks, there's no indication of any sweat on the inside. Also, many of them lack the bite cord or stick that you had in the back, because Javanese masks are not tied on like European ones. And in addition, some of the scholars have commented on the crudeness of the hair. So it's possible that these were given as gifts to Raffles with all his connections with the various courts on Java, or it could be that he commissioned them. Certainly, there's plentiful use of gold leaf, so these obviously were made in a court context, but may not have been used. So just to give you a sense, and again, these are not complete by Javanese standards. They're skewed. There's certain types are more plentiful than others. So we have, and they have, again, they haven't been properly identified. There are labels inside in Javanese and in English. The English ink has faded, and we need to do some scientific work to try and resurrect what that once said. The Javanese ink is much better. And they do give the names, and so we've adjusted the names. We had English names in the database ahead of time, and now we've been able to put in, what the Javanese says. This is an example of a monkey mask, because these would have been used in telling Ramayana, but also the Panji stories on Java. And this is a clown character. We do have a number of clown characters. And then, as I said, we have the most are the shadow puppets. We have more than 360. And again, important characters are missing. So Arjuna, we have a couple Arjuna puppets, but you should have at least 20 to produce, to have in a set to be able to produce proper, to perform proper representations of the Mahabharata and the and also the Ramayana. We lack clown puppets. And again, Raffles comments on this in his writings, where he says the clowns make people laugh, but they're not actually part of the history. So I think that's why he didn't collect them. So that was one of the few clowns we had. We have a couple Bhima puppets. Bhima, again, is a very important character in the Mahabharata. And puppets like this can be considered to be sacred. Again, this is not something that Raffles was considering when he was collecting. We also have a very large quantity, more than a quarter are puppets from Wayang Gedog, as opposed to Wayang Purwa. And, but we have very few, so these are the Panji stories, and we have actually very few of the character Panji himself. This is one of the few. So again, Raffles is clearly, he's collecting large bodies of material because he knows you're supposed to do that, but he's not actually collecting large bodies of material based on information that he's going to provide about Java. And we have quite a lot of monsters. Oh my goodness, we have so many monsters. Then we have these puppets. These are the Wayang Klitik. And again, a real mix. You couldn't put on a performance with the puppets that we have. And then somebody has cut off, I assume possibly for transportation to Britain, the rods that you would have held. And these have, again, been labeled oftentimes with names that the Javanese don't recognize anymore. This is the character Ajar Pamengar, but they're all beautifully done. Gold leaf, beautiful painting. And somebody has taken, most of them have writing on them, identifying the character. Most of these in Javanese and Dutch, but a few in English. And then we have these. These are the three-dimensional wooden puppets. They're possibly from the Surakarta courts. And again, with all these puppets, we've been trying to go through and see which ones are from Cirebon, which ones are from Central Java. If they're from Central Java, are they from Yogyakarta? Are they from Surakarta? But again, this research is still in the early phases. We have these three-dimensional puppets. Again, the rods have been cut off so they can stand on their bases. And Raffles, in his writings, talks about basically the wayang kulit, the wayang klitik, and wayang golek, but he didn't collect any, what we now know as wayang golek. So I'm wondering whether these might have been an earlier form of wayang golek. Again, the British Museum has the world's largest collections of these. They're no longer extant on Java. People don't seem to have much knowledge of them, and I believe there are a few scattered examples in the United States. But this is crying out for a bigger research project. And then here's Sabda Palone. Again, one of the clown characters that you find in these three-dimensional, in these puppets. And then, of course, we have these Gamalan instruments. So most of the gamelans seem to be from the northeastern coast and Madura. The instruments that are now in Claydon House in Buckinghamshire, which I don't have a picture of because nobody's allowed to take pictures of them, they're decorated with an abstract gold pattern on a red ground, which seems they may have come from Central Java, Jogja. There's evidence that they were tuned once, so they probably date to the second half of the 1700s. But the British Museum examples consist of 5 stylistic types. The largest grouping displays what we have one type like this, where you get these floral designs, but our biggest group of objects looks like this. So we have 5 stylistic, our instruments come from 5 different gamelan sets, and the largest grouping are these, with these red, black, and gold animal forms, and this is apparently a type that's most common from the northern coast, and they were much more exuberant than the restrained styles of the central region. Anyway, but as I said, none of these groups would constitute one formed by the Javanese. The instruments in each British Museum group are insufficient for a proper performance. We only have 6 of this type, and I think I may have put another, yeah. Here's a gambang in the shape of a bird, and here is I'm sorry, is that a little out of focus? I apologize. And here's another gambang in the form of a creature. So these aren't sufficient for a proper performance. The puppets would only allow for a very limited repertoire of narratives. So these collections, like his drawings, really do represent his superficial understanding of the topics and demonstrates that he was not collecting on Javanese terms. Although he collected in sets, it was not systematic. So given that material culture was not studied in a scholarly way by Europeans as texts were, these objects must have appealed to Raffles for other reasons. And I would argue that from his writings that it's possible to discern 3 main stimuli for the theatrical collections. First, Raffles considered the theater on Java to be a refined activity and hence worthy of notice. Second, he connected Javanese poetry, music, and theater with national history. And these, again, were all important aspects of European definitions of civilization. And third, although he did not say so explicitly, the objects themselves are visually striking, and many are lavishly covered with gold leaf, providing a sumptuous, exotic, and high-status appearance. Additionally, the theatrical materials were associated with the upper classes in Raffles' mind, and the quality of Raffles' theatrical materials indicates that they originated in court workshops. The theatrical objects were thus collected for the same reasons as the manuscripts, the drawings, the coins, and the sculptures. They connected with European notions of civilization that included language, a value for history, music, and poetry. Furthermore, they were identified with the primary social class, the people of condition, as Raffles called them, And so this is what he was referring to when he wrote about the positive qualities of the Javanese in his book. So in his History of Java, Raffles wrote that, quote, "National drama and dances constitute, next to music and poetry, the most conspicuous and refined of their amusements." And in his address to the Literary and Scientific Society in Batavia in 1815, he stated that, quote, "Dramatic representations of various kinds form the constant recreation of the higher classes of society and the most polished amusement of the country." For Raffles, the theater was associated with these upper classes, and shows were partially performed in the Kawi language, which Raffles defined as Java's classic language, distinct from others on the island and very ancient, claiming that all historical and poetical compositions of note were written in Kawi. He further wrote that, quote, "The general character of the language is strongly indicative of a former advanced state of civilization and illustrates in some degree the present character of the people. It is rich and refined." Thus, the music that he describes as monotonous, though pleasant, and the puppets that he describes as grotesque and distorted were associated with a refined classical language used for historical compositions. Additionally, he notes, quote, "By means of them," the performances, "the lower class have an opportunity of picking up a few Kawi terms and of becoming acquainted with the ancient legends of the country. Theatrical performances were thereby connected with the improvement of the lower classes, something that was very close to Raffles' own ideas and motivations regarding education, and we get more of this in his writings on Singapore. And as a result, he reviewed the theater as beneficent and indicative of a relatively advanced state of civilization that could easily be brought to a higher standard. Raffles also erroneously associated the theatrical stories, the Ramayana, the Mahabharata, the tales of Panji, and the Damarwulan narratives, with the history of the island, stating that in the Wayangs or scenic shadows, the subject of the performances is taken from the earliest period of history and fable, down to the destruction of the Hindu empire of Majapahit. They are distinguished according to the periods of the history which they represent by the terms Wayang Purwa, Wayang Gadog, and Wayang Klitik. So in Raffles' understanding, the subject of Wayang Purwa ranged from fabled history to the reign of Parikasit, the grandson of Arjuna from the Mahabharata. Wayang Gadog covered the time subsequent to this until the establishment of the kingdom of Pajajaran at the end of the Panji stories. And Wayang Klitik continued Java's history until the destruction of the Majapahit Empire. So it's unknown how he developed these ideas, yet they were a powerful draw for Raffles in the formation of his collection because an interest, as I've said before, in national history was important as a marker of civilization to Europeans generally and Raffles specifically. So of course the stories bear no relationship to empirical Javanese history other than using the names of some of the Javanese kingdoms. So the enthusiasm, of course, for shadow theater on Java was high, and Raffles wrote that, quote, "The interest excited by such spectacles is almost inconceivable. The eager multitude will sit listening with rapturous delight and profound attention for whole nights to these rude dramas." More importantly, end quote. More importantly, the theater provided opportunities for making the Javanese more civilized by ensuring a knowledge and regard for history. And he writes this. He says, "The constant exhibition of these plays in every part of the country has served to keep alive the recollections of days long since gone by, and to disseminate a general knowledge of native legendary history among many, with whom, from the ignorance of letters, the stories might otherwise have been irretrievably lost." So thus, Raffles viewed civilization, refinement, classicism, and history as coming together in Javanese theater. This is supported by the fact that he did not collect such items as Wayang Beber, which we saw in the previous presentation. He described that as a comparatively modern invention and not much esteemed. Collecting Wayang Beber, therefore, was not necessary or important because his purpose was not to explain Javanese theater to Europeans, but to demonstrate the state of Javanese civilization. So I see I'm running out of time, but I just have a few more pictures to show you. So despite his cultural interests, Raffles also kept an eye on the importance of colonies as sources of revenue. Raffles and his European compatriots regularly exclaimed positively over the fertility and lushness of Java, and that, of course, encouraged his enthusiasm for it as a British colony. He also noted the potential for a textile trade. As is evident from Raffles' packing lists, he not only collected for himself, but also for British business interests. So there were vegetable samples, there were textiles, there were drawings of plows and rakes, and carpenters, and model carpenters' tools, and farmers' tool sets. There are only a few models left now in the collection, but they do match some of the drawings, so we know that they were used as models for the publications. And so that obviously suggests that many are now lost, and these are two drawings from the inside. So while these items are substantially fewer than the historical and artistic materials because they did not further his argument about the civilized nature of Javanese culture, this aspect of Raffles' collections points towards a justification for the possession of Java, one that, in Raffles' opinion, the East India Company should have considered desirable. But we also have, here's some of the model weapons that we have. But we also have a few models of people of different professions and drawings of people. And these were, again, the basis for painted images that were then reproduced in his book. So these became very typical of British collecting later in the 19th century. Raffles collected these models of people as well as these drawings to show the varying types of people that you could find on Java and the professions. And some of these, as we see here, were reinterpreted for European audiences when included in his publication. Again, trying to make the exotic seem a little bit less foreign and a bit more able to connect with what people expected. So in conclusion, while there's been considerable interest in Raffles' collections for the information they can provide about early Java and natural history in island Southeast Asia, they also indicate which contemporary European ideas and concepts Raffles espoused. The focus upon the visually striking and the antique further suggests that Raffles had a firm eye upon impressing a European audience. As an individual with beautiful and exotic objects, he received substantial attention from scientific societies and royalty, as well as a knighthood, for his efforts in making information about Java available to the British public. A letter from Lord Minto, Raffles' patron in Southeast Asia, also indicates a personal desire for historic longevity. Lord Minto thanks Raffles for sending him a large inscription stone, and once mounted at home in Scotland, Minto writes that he hopes that it will tell Eastern tales of us long after our heads lay under smoother stones. However, Raffles was also committed to both British mercantilism and imperial expansion for the benefit of colonized people, envisaging that Java could attain its full agricultural and commercial potential. Yet he was very concerned with his mission to civilize Java, as demonstrated by his comment that, quote, if we could indulge ourselves, we might contemplate the present semi-barbarous condition, ignorance, and poverty of these innumerable islands, the Indonesian archipelago, exchanged for a state of refinement, prosperity, and happiness. Through collecting, Raffles attempted to demonstrate that the British could help recover Java's lost past and thereby improve the future. The objects lent physical substance to his racist categorization of Java as relatively civilized due to its history in the form of stone monuments and sculpture and contemporary engagement with history in the theater. This, in combination with Java's fertile land, reified British acts of imperial appropriation. In drawing upon his collections in the writing of the history of Java, Raffles was anxious to be vindicated in his economic policies and his efforts to civilize the Javanese. His collections were thus gathered as evidence to validate his beliefs and promote himself as a scholar and colonial administrator. Yet the death of his main royal supporter, Princess Charlotte, and as well as his patron, Lord Minto, his struggles and disgrace with the East India Company, the fact that he wasn't a particularly good administrator, and he lost money before the East India Company demanded money from him as well. So he lost this money at the end of his life. And in addition to the fact that anthropological collecting had not really begun in earnest in Europe, the earliest ethnographic museum was only built in the 1830s. means that his collections and his ideas made little impact at the time. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Alexandra. That was very interesting. So there's a lot to learn from this collection at the British Museum and from your story. Wonderful. Thank you so much. We now have a break. En ik ga dan door in het Nederlands. U krijgt zo wat te drinken, wat te eten. U kunt zo naar buiten lopen. En het programma van de online, dat zal nu even stoppen. Wij gaan stipt om 2:15 weer opnieuw beginnen. Opnieuw, als u tijdens deze pauze al vragen heeft, kunt u die stellen aan een van de bestuursleden. Misschien kunnen die even opstaan. Ja, daar, zo, en ik en René. Nou, daar zult u het mee moeten doen, maar verder is dan natuurlijk de Q&A later in het programma. Dus hartelijk dank voor nu en wij zien elkaar stipt om 2:15. Dank u wel. Welkom, dames en heren, voor het tweede deel van ons symposium vandaag. We hebben hele boeiende presentaties al gehad. Dat gaan we nu in het tweede deel ook voortzetten. Het is zo dat Alexandra Green daar zal nog optreden als referent. William Southworth, omdat het nogal uitliep, hebben we gedacht dat doen we dan bij de Q&A. Dus dat houdt u nog te goed. Dat William ook een commentaar zal geven vanuit het perspectief, het Nederlands perspectief en het Rijksmuseum. Dan gaan we nu spreken over het verzamelbeleid van de Koninklijke Vereniging van Vrienden der Aziatische Kunst. En dat zal worden besproken door René Steenbergen, ons bestuurslid en vicevoorzitter. Tevens belast met de belangrijke portefeuille schenkingen en legaten. René is kunsthistoricus, mecenaatsdeskundige en onder meer bezig met een publicatie over de noodzakelijke hervormingen van de kunstsector na corona. René, aan jou het woord.
Goedemiddag, welkom. Ik wou graag mijn eerste... Nee, en dat is niet de eerste. Zoals u allen weet is de vereniging in 1918 opgericht. En ik wou het hier vooral hebben over de eerste decennia, eigenlijk tot de Tweede Wereldoorlog. Want daar werd het verzamelbeleid geëikt waar wij nog steeds eigenlijk de basisgedachte van in ere houden. En dus het is goed om daar even bij stil te staan. En mijn voordracht zal niet heel lang zijn. Die is bedoeld als een introductie op die van William Southworth, die op 3 objecten ingaat uit de collectie van de vereniging, waar hij de provenance zo ver mogelijk van heeft uitgezocht. Maar in dat kader is het goed om even te weten hoe werd er verzameld door de vereniging en waarom. Ik neem u dus heel kort even mee naar die ontstaansgeschiedenis. Ja, dit is natuurlijk, u kent het Aziatisch paviljoen. De behuizing sinds 2013, sinds de heropening van het Rijksmuseum. Maar dat is de derde behuizing van de collectie inmiddels. En hier ziet u, ik zal heel kort bij stilstaan, de heren stichters van het eerste uur. En daar ziet u linksboven Herman Visser. Dat was de eerste conservator, ook heel belangrijk, omdat hij enorm veel kennis met zich meebracht. En u ziet ook rechtsboven Herman Karel Westendorp, dat was de eerste voorzitter. En deze mannen hebben ook veel gedoneerd, zowel in geld als in kunst aan de vereniging. Heel kort even waarom die vereniging. U moet zich voorstellen, het kwam al even ter sprake, er waren volkenkundige musea in Nederland, maar er was nog geen collectie kunst gemaakt voor de eigen culturen. Dus geen volkenkundige etnografische objecten die primair gebruiksvoorwerpen zijn, maar kunstobjecten. Geen exportkunst werd al even genoemd. En dat was wel een beetje, maar niet substantieel aanwezig in de Nederlandse musea. En het aanvankelijke idee van deze heren, veelal dus verzamelaars, was: wij gaan een museum beginnen. En eerst hebben ze geprobeerd samen te werken met de bestaande musea, maar ja, dat zult u begrijpen, Leiden met name, die had helemaal geen zin om die kunstvoorwerpen die zij hadden, die in aanmerking kwamen voor deze te vormen collectie, om die af te staan daarvoor. Dus al heel snel kwam het idee op om eerst tentoonstellingen te gaan organiseren, om de missie onder de aandacht te brengen. Dat waren dus heel vaak stukken uit bruikleen van leden. Want ik moet daar even bij zeggen, wie waren dan de mensen die zich aansloten bij de vereniging? Dat was toch echt wel een substantiële groep. Dat waren eigenlijk vooral mensen die op de een of andere manier gelieerd waren aan wat toen nog heette Nederlands-Indië. Kooplieden, maar ook diplomaten, bankiers, reders, eigenaren van exportfirma's. Dat was eigenlijk een hele grote groep en een aantal daarvan had behoorlijke welstand bereikt en die werden destijds de Indische fortuinen genoemd. Dus dat was wat je noemt een doelgroep met veel potentie. En wat je ook zag, daar kom ik dadelijk nog op terug, Aziatische kunst was deftig. Je ziet nogal wat, we hebben niet zo heel veel adel in Nederland, maar families als Six, Labouchere, die waren allemaal lid. We hadden ook grote verzamelaars die lid voor het leven meteen werden, zoals het echtpaar Krullen-Müller bijvoorbeeld. Dus je ziet, ik kom daar later op terug, de manier van verzamelen, dat het enorm aansprak. En ook kunstenaars overigens, die zich lieten inspireren door Azië, Orientalisme hadden we. Dus het was een substantiële groep en de vereniging voorzag dus echt in een behoefte. En al heel snel begon men tentoonstellingen te organiseren uit collecties van leden die ik noemde, die groepen. En dat had ook veel succes. En dat deden ze natuurlijk in bestaande musea. In het Stedelijk Museum in Amsterdam, Gemeentemuseum Den Haag, Rijksmuseum ook. Daar waren ze te gast en dat trok veel publiek. Maar al snel kwam ook dat plan weer terug. Wij moeten zelf gaan verzamelen. En dat idee werd eigenlijk in de jaren 20 mede door die tentoonstelling werd dat idee onderbouwd van wat gaan we dan verzamelen en waarom. En daar wil ik even bij stilstaan, omdat we nu hebben het heel duidelijk over Aziatische kunst als een aparte categorie. Maar wat we eigenlijk zien bij de leden is dat heel veel van hen niet uitsluitend Aziatische kunst verzamelden in de tijd. Het was onderdeel van een groter geheel. We hebben daar bij het jubileumsymposium in 2018 ook bij stilgestaan. Dat werd wel genoemd Ars Una. En dat was het idee van één grote wereldcultuur, waarin alle bloeiperiodes eigenlijk werden samengevat. En dat ziet u hier in het klein geïllustreerd aan de schrijftafel van mevrouw Krullen-Müller in Den Haag. En u ziet daar een combinatie van middeleeuwse kunst, links voor een Chinees blanc de Chine beeldje. Het is niet allemaal zo goed te zien, maar er zijn meer Aziatische voorwerpen. En het is ook te zien aan destijds het museum Scheurleer in Den Haag, een particulier museum. En daar ziet u privécollecties. Dat gaat dan van Egyptisch naar Grieks, Romeins en Oost-Aziatisch. En dat werd samengebracht als het beste van de wereldculturen, Ars Una. En het was een idee dat na natuurlijk de verschrikkelijke Eerste Wereldoorlog enorm postvatte in Europa. Het idee van we moeten over grenzen heen kijken, we moeten de wapens laten zakken. We zijn eigenlijk allemaal met elkaar verbonden en dat idee moeten we uitdragen. En de antroposofie was daar bijvoorbeeld ook een belangrijke voorstander van. Dus dat even voor de achtergrond van het idee wat heel veel van deze leden aanhingen. Maar nog steeds was daar dus de gedachte, die collectie die er moet komen. En wat was nou de beste manier om destijds kunst te kopen? Dat was naar de landen van herkomst te gaan. En die landen van herkomst waren, ik vertel u niks nieuws, waren natuurlijk vaak koloniën van de landen waar de verzamelaars zaten in het Westen. Dus er werd geld ingezameld. Dat heeft de vereniging goed gedaan. Dankzij deze trouwe en ook vermogende achterban hadden ze nog net voor de beurskracht van 1929... hebben ze 150.000 gulden kunnen inzamelen. Nou, dat moet u met een factor 20 tot 25 ongeveer vermenigvuldigen. En dat was destijds een heel groot bedrag, omdat de prijzen natuurlijk ook nog heel anders lagen dan nu. En de heren Westendorp en Visser, ik liet ze er net even zien, die zijn op de boot gestapt en die zijn natuurlijk allereerst naar Nederlands-Indië gegaan. En wat hebben ze daar gekocht? Nou, er kwam hier al even wat langs. Ze zijn allereerst naar, en zo ging dat dan, je ging dan naar de Nederlandse oudheidkundige dienst op Java en die selecteerde. Ik noem dat ook omdat William daar straks verder op in zal gaan. Die zei dan, luister, wij zijn bezig tempels te restaureren, we hebben archeologische vondsten gedaan, we kijken zoveel mogelijk wat kunnen we terugplaatsen in die tempels. En dingen die we niet kunnen thuisbrengen, die zijn te koop of te leen, gebeurde ook wel. En zo zijn onder andere is de Hindoe-Javaanse steengroep die u in het Aziatisch paviljoen kunt zien, of de bovenverdieping, is samengebracht. Dat is een groep van 5. En William zal daar straks ook verder op ingaan, maar een aantal van die stukken waren destijds in bruikleen door de oudheidkundige dienst. Want ze zeiden, als wij er alsnog achterkomen dat we die stukken kunnen herplaatsen, dan willen we ze graag terug uit Nederland. En dan kunnen jullie wat anders uitkiezen. Dus er is toen wel degelijk met zorgvuldigheid gekeken naar wat wel en niet Nederlands-Indië uit mocht. Nou, dat is dus één manier die er is gedaan om stukken te verwerven. De reis ging vervolgens verder door Zuidoost-Azië. Dat was Frans Indochina destijds. Ook daar ging men dan naar de oudheidkundige dienst. Dat was in Hanoi. En ook daar gold wat was er nodig voor restauratie. En dan hadden de Franse musea natuurlijk de eerste keus. Maar ook daar kon men een aantal stukken verwerven. En ik geloof dat Visser toen naar Nederland terug is gekeerd. En Westendorp is met zijn vrouw nog verder gereisd naar China en Japan. 1931 was iedereen weer terug. Er waren bijna 100 stukken aangekocht, grote en kleine. En die kwamen natuurlijk langzamerhand met boten naar Nederland. En toen was de tijd rijp om een museum te openen. En hier ziet u de opening van, het was de achterzaal in het Stedelijk Museum, Amsterdam. Want het Stedelijk Museum was destijds meer een soort kunsthal. Er werden zalen verhuurd. En het was nog geen modern en hedendaags kunstmuseum zoals het nu is. En dit was de tuinzaal en daar hing een bord boven de deur, Aziatisch Kunstmuseum. En hier ziet u links met het brilletje de voorzitter Westendorp met slobkousen nog aan. En rechts minister Visser van onder meer cultuur en die verrichtte de opening. Gekocht in de landen van herkomst dus zelf. Een ander belangrijke bron was aankopen bij handelaren in het Westen, in Europa met name. Want na die aankoopreis was er nog behoorlijk geld over. En inmiddels was crisistijd aangebroken. En begonnen verzamelaars ook stukken te veilen en te verkopen. En daar heeft de vereniging goed gebruik van kunnen maken, omdat ze dus die zak met geld nog hadden. Toen is onder meer deze hemelse schoonheid, de nimf, India's beeld is verworven. Bij een Chinees-Franse handelaar, C.T. Lu, is deze Shiva Nataraja verworven, die heel prominent op de bovenverdieping van het Aziatisch paviljoen staat. De dansende Shiva, de koning der dansers. En het is ook een heel groot beeld. Dus dat kwam via de handel binnen. Diezelfde C.T. Loo was een regelmatige schenker aan de vereniging. Want schenkingen, daar kom ik zo op, zijn eigenlijk altijd een van de belangrijkste bronnen van herkomst geweest. En schonk niet lang na die aankoop dit Longman-beeld aan de vereniging in 1938. Dat is dus de derde bron van inkomsten na aankopen in de landen van herkomst en aankopen bij handelaren in het Westen, schenkingen. En daarvan zijn er vele geweest. Ik kom daar aan het eind nog op terug, want dat loopt tot op de dag van vandaag door. En dat is ontzettend belangrijk voor de vereniging. Wat ook een bron werd in de jaren 30 door die crisistijd die ik al noemde, is aankopen van andere verzamelaars. En dit beeld, de Guanyin, ook te zien in het paviljoen op de benedenverdieping in een eigen nis, die is gekocht uit een Amerikaanse collectie in de jaren 30. Langzamerhand zie je ook die verschuiving komen, dat er in het Westen meer kunstvoorwerpen, Aziatische kunstvoorwerpen kwamen en dat een nieuwe bron van aankoop werd. Ja, en dan kwam natuurlijk de periode van de Tweede Wereldoorlog. En aan het eind daarvan waren behoorlijk wat stichters en schenkers waren overleden door ouderdom, maar natuurlijk ook Joodse leden die vermoord waren. Dus de vereniging was behoorlijk uitgedund en inmiddels was het landschap, het klimaat was behoorlijk veranderd. Mensen waren verarmd door crisistijd en oorlog. En het oude systeem van de stichters en donateurs, die houden de vereniging overeind. En die komen ook weer over de brug als er een interessante aankoop gedaan kan worden. Dat kon eigenlijk niet meer echt volgehouden worden. Het Stedelijk Museum onder Sandberg werd een museum voor moderne en hedendaagse kunst. Dus het Museum voor Aziatische Kunst moest verhuizen. En dat kwam in 1952 onder het dak van het Rijksmuseum. Hier ziet u het staan, ik weet niet of u het allemaal kunt lezen. Dit was de ingang naar de drukkervleugel en er staat Rijksmuseum met daaronder ingang Aziatische kunst. Dus het had nog wel een eigen ingang en een eigen bordje, maar het was natuurlijk wel geïncorporeerd in een veel groter museum. En dit is dan de vrij moderne opstelling van een aantal stukken in de jaren 60 in die vleugel. Dit zijn ook schenkingen geweest. Ik ga daar nu niet allemaal bij stilstaan. Dit is een bruikleen dat we nu nog hebben. En dan komen we bij de recentere. Overigens het beeldje, Shotoku, het prinsje Shotoku, waarvan gezegd wordt, een Japans beeld, dat hij de eerste boeddhist was in Japan. Dat is in bruikleen gegeven in de jaren 30 en is formeel nog altijd in bruikleen en eigenaar niet meer te achterhalen. Dus dat is een voorbeeld van een belangrijk stuk dat op die manier naar de vereniging is gekomen. Daarachter in de vitrine ziet u ceremoniële weefsels, geschonken door Jan Dees en René van der Star. Dat is een recente schenking geweest waar we heel blij mee zijn. En daar komt eigenlijk ook nog steeds bij. En dat brengt mij aan het laatste deel van mijn korte inleiding over de verzamelgeschiedenis van de vereniging. Het belang eigenlijk van de particuliere vereniging binnen en naast het Rijksmuseum. Want het Rijksmuseum is natuurlijk, zoals dat heet, de goede huisvader voor de collectie van de vereniging, die, zoals Pieter al zei, uit ruim 1850 stukken bestaat. Wij zijn partners daarin en kopen soms, ik denk dat ik daar ook wel een plaatje van heb, samen aan. Zoals nog bij het jubileum een Chinese rolschildering, gezamenlijk aangekocht met het Rijksmuseum, een nieuwe vorm van verwerving. Maar die eigen identiteit en die relatieve zelfstandigheid van de vereniging bewijst zich ook nu weer eigenlijk in de afgelopen tijd. Wij kunnen natuurlijk af en toe wel andere keuzes maken dan het museum. En zeggen van nou, wij kunnen ook dingen onder onze hoede nemen die hier waarvan het museum misschien zegt, nou, misschien ligt het politiek wat gevoelig en waarvan wij zeggen, nou, wij wachten dat rustig af. Tegelijkertijd zien we natuurlijk enorm het belang van herkomstonderzoek, ook in het kader van de verzamelgeschiedenis. Hè. Het ging er hier al even over. Vaak loopt het in de landen van herkomst snel vast, omdat destijds weinig is gedocumenteerd over wie waren die handelaren, wie waren misschien lokale mensen die stukken verkochten. Daar is toen heel weinig aandacht voor geweest. En toch moeten we dat natuurlijk wel met z'n allen blijven proberen. Maar goed, de vereniging, zoals gezegd, heeft dus een wat ruimere bewegingsvrijheid op sommige punten. En dat is ook iets wat onze verzamelaars belangrijk vinden. Hè. De collectie van de vereniging voelt meer eigen, denk ik, dan een museumcollectie voor museumbezoekers voelt. En dat merken wij ook in de schenkingen. Zeker ook de afgelopen tijd door corona zijn meer mensen gaan nadenken over, ja, ik moet het eigenlijk regelen, want je wordt er toch weer even aan herinnerd dat de kunst langer leeft dan wij. En wij hebben dat mogen merken de afgelopen tijd. Ik liet al even de Indonesische weefsels zien. We hebben ook net voor corona nog een substantiële collectie Japanse zen-boeddhistische rolschilderingen ontvangen, door Felix Hess geschonken. En sinds vorige week zijn wij de trotse eigenaar van 77 Chinese objecten, van Neolithicum tot Ming, die Koos de Jong heeft geschonken. En die zullen functioneren als studiecollectie. En er zijn meer schenkingen op komst. Er zijn mensen die ook het een en ander al in testament hebben vastgelegd, ook legaten. En daar zijn wij natuurlijk enorm dankbaar voor, want als vereniging kunnen wij geen subsidie aanvragen. En dit is eigenlijk altijd de kurk geweest waarop onze vereniging drijft. Dus we zijn de leden daar heel dankbaar voor. En we zijn altijd geïnteresseerd als u denkt, kom eens kijken bij mij. We zijn natuurlijk ook heel blij met, toch in zekere zin ook weer een eigen behuizing voor de vereniging. Het Aziatisch paviljoen dat er zonder de KVVAK-collectie niet geweest zou zijn. Na dit reclamepraatje geef ik graag het woord aan William Southworth, maar dat doet Pieter misschien.
Yes, William, please, you're welcome. William Southworth is since 2011 curator Southeast Asia with the Rijksmuseum. We know him from his various publications, also in Aziatische kunst. William will speak on the special history and provenance of Javanese sculptures in the collection of the KVVAK. And at the start of the Q&A, you will also refer to Alexandra Green's lecture. Thank you very much. Please, go ahead.
Thank you very much, Peter, for that introduction. Yes. My talk today is on the provenance of Indonesian artifacts in the collection of the KVVAK. The original title, I think, was Disputed Provenance. But what I meant by that was artifacts which there was a question mark over. In other words, which we ourselves thought, okay, maybe we should know more about the provenance of this object. The first example, and I show this with a warning because you may be shocked by the content, but it's not exactly how it may appear. This is a letter found in the archives by my colleague Menno Fitzke, who was actually looking through a file on Japanese art. And it's a letter written by Theo van Epp to Herman Visser, who was the curator of the Society's collection at the time. And it reads, the first few lines read, Hedenmorgen het eerste voorlopige offensief begonnen tegen de kampong BR. Deze bleek zwaar versterkt en bood hevige tegenstand. Ik opende het vuur met licht fel geschut op 2500 iets doch trof geen doel. Ik zal binnenkort met zwaarden geschut den aanval voortzetten. This sounds horrific. And for a long time, I have to admit, it lay on my desk wondering what on earth is this about? Theo van Epp was, or is best known as the first restorer of the Borobudur and was a man of great integrity. He was trained as an engineer, and he did see some military action in the 1890s in the Aceh Wars, but very shortly after that, he was not transported. He was assigned to first the Archaeological Commission and then the Oude Kundedienst, the Archaeological Service, for restoration. And that really was the bulk of his career. And the letter is signed 8th of September, 1932. And this was long after he had actually retired from service in Indonesia. And he was living at the time, and we know this because the letter is stamped, Albertinestraat 12, Den Haag. So what then is Kampong BR? I should also say that after this statement, there's a discussion of a bronze Buddha, transporting a bronze Buddha. And it's clear after research that the bronze Buddha is this very famous example of an Amaravati-style bronze Buddha found actually in East Java, but in a very early Central Javanese style. To cut the story short, this was actually in the ownership of a lady called Mevrouw Broekveld. And the letter is allegorical, it's allegories. It's actually detailing Theo van Epp's attempt to buy the bronze from her. And it's he's using this allegory, I think, because partly because he's sending himself up. In other words, he's explaining his attempts, his negotiations, as if it was a military assault on this poor lady. It should also be mentioned that this letter was written by Theo van Epp to Herman Visser as a private letter. This was never meant to be broadcast to the public. But at the same time, there's an element of black humor in this approach. And you think, well, was this actually, is this meant to be funny? And to be honest, I do find it quite funny. And maybe this is because I'm English. I have famously bad sense of humor. But the humor is not in the situation. He's not making fun of military actions against Indonesian villages. The point he's trying to make is he's trying to highlight the difference between how the society's collection was actually acquired through endless negotiations with private collectors who were sometimes rather unwilling to sell their objects or wanted a higher price or thought it was more important than they thought. The comparison with that and how many members of the public then and now viewed how the collection was acquired. In other words, through military force. So the humor is between the reality and the perception. And this is one of the biggest problems, I think, that the society has today, is that the perception of how things were acquired is completely different from actually the reality. Okay. The second question mark was over an object first first exhibited by the Society in the 1930s. And at the time, it was in this exhibition on Asiatische Kunst, and it was described, actually I should show the object. Yeah, this is the object. And it was described in the exhibition under the following notice, which said, heeft toebehoord aan Diepenegoro, daarna collecties Baron Desales, Jonkheer Dane van Varik, and Jonkheer Sauperstein. Now, this is important because Diepenegoro is one of the great popular heroes of modern Indonesia, and he was the leader of the Indonesian, the Javanese resistance during the Java War of 1825 to 1830. And at the beginning of the war, his residence, I think it was actually the residence of his aunt, but that's where he was staying, was actually destroyed by forces from the colonial Dutch authorities with the Sultan of Yogyakarta. So this is a kind of key moment, actually, in the history of Netherlands India. And this attribution was investigated again by Theo van Epp, who wrote a long article on the sculpture. And his interest actually was not so much in the link with Diepenegoro, but the fact that it gave an indication of where originally the sculpture may have been from. In other words, if it had been owned by Diepenegoro, it may well have come from the Yogyakarta area. But what he did was he traced the former owners and asked them where did where did the sculpture come from? And he wrote, and again this is in Dutch, but it makes the point. It says, this is the account given, actually I can go further. This is one of our best pieces. It's a fantastic sculpture. And the former owner found by Theo van Epp was a man called Van Sauperstein. I think I mispronounce it every time. But he was a minor member of the nobility. He was very proud of his noble ancestors. And he owned a house, the House Sauperstein, in Nieuwe Loosdrecht, which he was keen to fill with objects from noble families. So that was, I think, his main interest. And he sold the object to a very interesting man, Heuser, in 1935, who was, I think, most interested in the Diepenegoro connection. He wrote several articles on Java and on Javanese artifacts. And Heuser sold it to the Society in 1936. So this we can be very certain about. But Sauperstein told Theo van Epp this story. And it goes, tijdens de Java-oorlog zou het, de sculpture, door den commandant J.U. Baron Desales aangetroffen zijn in de woning van Diepenegoro. De in 1839 tot kolonel bevorderde Baron Desales voerde het in 1840 mede naar Holland. Het beeld ging later over in het bezit van zijn schoonzoon, Jonkheer Dane van Varik. Bij een zoon van deze, meneer Dane van Varik, stond het vele jaren in de tuin van zijn woning aan het noordeinde te Schravenhagen. Op een goede dag werd het verkocht aan den antiquair meneer Turnison te plaatsen. Jonkheer van Sauperstein kende het beeld reeds vele jaren. Toen hij van den verkoop hoorde, haastte hij zich het van den antiquair te kopen. Hij voerde het mee naar Huize Superstein, te Nieuwe Loosdrecht. Tot zover de mededelingen van laatstgenoemde. So that was the story that was given him, and that was published in the 1930s. So, yes, this is kind of in brief the early history of the object that was published at that time. And what we wanted to investigate is actually, is this true at all? I'll go back. The first part, basically, we know that it was in the collection of Dana van Varik only because Sauperstein himself had seen it in the garden. But the earlier history is uncertain. Whether that it was owned by Dana van Varik's father of the same name seems quite likely. But he was supposed to get it from his stepfather, J.U. Baron Desales, commandant. Unfortunately, there is no Baron Desales, J.U. Baron Desales. The only Baron Desales during the Java War was actually Rudolf Antony Baron Desales, and he was not in Indonesia at that time. He was retired. He had worked for the VOC in his youth, but he had retired to a comfortable life in the Netherlands. Also, he was not in any way the father-in-law, I should have said, of Dana van Varik. The father-in-law of Dana van Varik was actually Isaac August Baron Melville von Kahnbay, another leading member of the aristocracy. He, in turn, was the I can only think of the Dutch. He was the son-in-law of Baron Desales. So you think, okay, maybe it actually came from Melville von Kahnbay and not from Desales at all. But again, Baron Desales had 3 sons, and these sons were present in Indonesia at the time of the Java War. The first, the oldest, Johann Baptist Desales, was a resident of Rembang on the north coast. And as far as we know, he has no connection with Yogyakarta or with the Java War itself. The second, however, the second son, Adriaan Maurits Theodorus Desales, was extremely important. He was resident of Surakarta and Yogyakarta. But he left before the attack on Diponegoro's Kraton. And this is important because actually, according to the historian Peter Carey, he had very good relations with Diponegoro. He was described actually as a friend of Diponegoro. And he was horrified at the news of the attack when he had returned to the Netherlands. And he was made part of a commission by the king to look into what had happened. And he wrote a report, an extremely critical report, of what had actually happened during that attack. So he certainly has a connection with Diponegoro, but not the one implied in this story. The third son is Charles Paul Amarant Desales. And he was the only son to actually outlive his father. So he's the only one who actually became a Baron Desales. And he also got the additional title Baron Desales Soglio Meyenfeld. He was also a lieutenant colonel, so he also had the right military rank, and he was present during the Java War. So in the years since, it has sometimes been assumed that this must have been the Baron Desales mentioned. But actually, this is extremely unlikely. And I say this because, how did the image actually get into? He was not in any way the father-in-law of Dana van Varik. So there's no natural connection. The second is that he was a leading member of the Dutch aristocracy in the late 19th century, and he's the perfect candidate for anybody buying a sculpture. If you wanted something which had an aristocratic heritage, this is the person you would want it from. So why is the name in the story so wrong? How did Charles Paul Amarant Desales become Baron J.U. Desales? Actually, it's possible that this is completely wrong. It should be remembered that the statue was not bought by Meneer Sauperstein directly from the family Desales. He bought it from an art dealer. And one of the things we have in the Rijksmuseum is actually the Sword of Jb Desales. And this was bought in 1880 from the art market, and it had been in the possession of none other than Melville van Cambay. So it's possible that actually and it's also engraved, there's an engraving in gold, which says, Jb Desales, Baron Desales. In other words, the art dealer has added value, I think, by increasing the aristocratic connection. So we know that it's quite possible that objects belonging to Jb Desales were sent after his death to his sister, who was the wife of Cambay. So that at least gives you some connection. But the point in conclusion is that actually we don't know anything about this object. We don't know that it was ever in the family Desales, and still less that it comes from the Woning of Diep Nogoro. And this is perhaps, yes, the final point I would like to make on this, is that who is the authority for this provenance? And in all the discussion over, the connection with Diep Nogoro, one can think, well, this story isn't coming from left-wing journalists. It's not coming from ambitious researchers. The authority for this story is you. The authority is the Koninklijke Vereniging van Vrienden der Aziatische Kunst, because the only publications that assert that that statue belonged to Diep Nogoro are publications of the society itself. And this is not untypical of other things in the collection, because what mattered in the early 20th century was the story. You wanted a good story. And the research was not done on the particulars. It wasn't challenged in that way. But now, we're actually creating problems for ourselves through these old stories. The third group I want to talk about very briefly, I'm okay. And is a collection of objects that were sent from the Oude Kundigedienst, and René has already spoken on these. And I wrote an article, thankfully, because of the publications and the archives of the Oude Kundigedienst, you can actually trace back a lot of the history of the objects. So that was the subject of my research. But the question mark that remains is actually the status of the objects. Because 12 objects were sent in 1932 from the Oude Kundigedienst, and 5 of them were classified as an geschenk. They were a gift. So the objects were actually given to the society. And so there's no problem about the legal status of these objects. But 7, and these are some of the biggest pieces. 7 were actually sent as a bruikleen, as a loan, long-term loan to the society. And that raises the question, and which I've also raised earlier with Peter and René, as, who actually now is the owner of the object? Wie is de eigenaar? And that's not an easy question to answer. One possibility, the Oude-Kundige Dienst was, of course, a colonial institution. And one possibility is that these objects, after independence, reverted back to the Dutch state. So that is one possibility. Another possibility, which again we're looking into, is that these actually may be inherited or at least theoretically owned by the Indonesian Archaeological Service. And this sounds like, a little bit of a shock, but in 2013, the Indonesian Archaeological Service, the Pusat Arkeologi Nasional, celebrated its 100th anniversary. And in other words, it dated it from 1913, which is the founding date of the Oude-Kundige Dienst. And that's because they see themselves as the legal successor of the Oude-Kundige Dienst. That, however, also implies, if this is in any way correct, that also implies that the Oude-Kundige Dienst is the legal forerunner of the Pusat Arkeologi Nasional. And that raises the possibility that actually the terms of the loan agreement may actually still be valid. And as René also mentioned earlier, the terms are very interesting. They were set by FDK Bosch, who was the head of the Archaeological Service at the time. And he, in his letters to Westendorp, the chairman of the society, he stated that if these objects were required for restoration purposes, that they should be sent without question back at the expense of the society, but that in negotiation with the society, they would then be replaced by objects of equal artistic value. And you think, what a strange agreement, but actually, I think an extremely good one, because what he's doing with that is he's saying, if he's underlying both the restoration program in Java, if something is vital for restoration, this should go back, but is also underlying the right of the society to display objects from Indonesia, and underlining the purpose of that, which is to educate the public. So, yes, this is an area which we need to look into, and we need to look at the legal results. But I think actually, although an agreement dating from the 1930s, this is actually not a bad way to go in terms of future arrangements. But it depends entirely on relations with the authorities in Indonesia. And so establishing good relations is really important. To end, I just wanted to make another point on heads. One object which appears very much in debates is, of course, the head from Borobudur, Archimac 239, which has actually been in the Society's collection, I think, since the 1940s, but Earlier, it was earlier in the Netherlands in a private collection since the early 1920s. But we have a lot of heads. Heads were valued as archaeological items, archaeological fragments, and were very good at establishing style. So you only needed a head to establish the style of an object. But we have a lot of loose fragments, and one solution to that problem is to actually do 3D scanning of the heads and to see if they match up. One of the assumptions is that of many visitors who see heads in museums is that, okay, the head has been cut off for a statue, the statue is standing somewhere in Java without a head, this is wrong. In many cases, that isn't actually the case. There are obviously many heads which just don't have a body, and heads are usually, and I say this as an archaeologist, the easiest place to break a statue is the neck. That's the weak point in any figurative sculpture. So if it falls over, the head will fall off. It will break off. And so most of the heads in archaeological collections, is fallen over and the head is rolled away. But with 3D scanning, you can actually, you can do a lot to establish, is there a body for this statue? Is there a head for the body? And to try to match it up. It should be stated that in the 1970s, during the UNESCO restoration of Borobudur, a lot was done. Jan Fontaine made an inventory of heads from the Borobudur in private collections worldwide and tried to match them up. Only 2 could actually be matched up. But with modern techniques, you can maybe do more. And this is not just, I think, for the Borobudur, but for other sculptures as well. But I should also state that, the fact that there's if a body can be found, very often the body is not on display, it's not even on site, it's actually in storage somewhere. And so matching the head with the body, and this is, again, this is coming from an archaeologist, matching is what you want to do, because then you can see that, you can appreciate the whole sculpture. And what I would like to do is actually match heads with bodies where we can actually bring the whole thing to put on show in the Rijksmuseum. But again, this requires negotiation, it requires cooperation with authorities in the countries concerned. And this is not just for Indonesia, this is actually broader for countries like Cambodia as well, where in some cases we have a good idea where a body might be. So these archaeological elements are also an area where we can do something. I don't think we need to be too defensive, actually. I think there's lots of proactive elements that we can do. Okay, thank you.
Zo, dames en heren, dat was heel boeiend. We krijgen zo de Q&A. Er kunnen vragen worden gesteld. Eerst al wil je nog kort reflecteren op de lecture van Alexandra Green. U ziet, er worden wat stoeltjes neergezet en een microfoon verzorgd. Dus het systeem is, we hebben de vragen via de chat. Die komen binnen bij Rosalien. En er is een microfoon. Rosalien staat achter in de zaal. En die kan de microfoon geven aan degene die een vraag willen stellen. En we hopen op een mooie, actieve Q&A. Vandaag kunt u de vragen stellen, uw statements maken. En we gaan dat allemaal verder natuurlijk voortzetten in de toekomst. Dat is duidelijk. Goed, René.
Gaat hij aan? Ja, ik ben al... Het is gelukt. May I invite all the speakers to come and sit here? Thank you. just take a seat. Well, in the middle, maybe. Ladies in the middle. Yeah, sure. Klaas? Yeah.
Pak hier.
Yeah, sure. First, I would like to ask the speakers to shortly reflect on each other's lectures, because I can imagine that this gave new questions to think over, huh? Especially, I could start with a remark of Klaas, which I found interesting. You said the lines, the limits between institutional and private owners, historically, in historical perspective, are fluid, as you call it.
Mm-hmm.
William or Alexandra, could you reflect on that? Is that something that is appealing to you, or do you have a different opinion?
I think maybe I've just lost my voice. So maybe Alexandra first.
I mean, if I can just start with maybe something slightly off topic. I mean, I loved your talk, William, and I'm very sorry I can't comment on yours.
No, of course,
I do apologize.
Sorry about that.
Well, I'm quite fascinated that these stories being, in a sense, made up to give the pieces provenance, because we have quite a lot of pieces in the British Museum that are Buddha images from Myanmar that are extremely crude. Very poorly carved, very poorly painted, but yet on the bottom will be inscribed a present from King Thibaw. And we have so many like that. And I just think you look at the quality of this piece, and this is
Couldn't
not
be true.
It can't possibly be true. Or, in the process of working on the Raffles and also the provenance of the Southeast Asian collection generally, I'm quite fascinated that things were always given by a chief or so I think there's a lot of that going on that we actually just don't appreciate now. And again, you have to start doing this type of digging. Anyway, sorry, that probably didn't address. I just was struck by that because I hadn't really thought about it before other than superficially.
Well, William, you actually told me that you also talked about this Diponegoro Shiva in Jakarta.
Yes.
And that you were sort of anxious about the reactions from the Indonesian audience when you carefully posed your statement that it might not have come from the home of Diponegoro. And then you told me that Homeric laughing came from the Indonesian attendees, and they said, there are so many stories about objects from Diponegoro, we know they can't all be true.
I mean, actually, it was interesting because in 2016, there was a staff of Diponegoro, which was actually belonged to the family Bout. Bout was one of the major generals of the war, and it was given to him. There's a letter from the 1830s saying this was the staff of Diponegoro, and it stayed in the family, and was then a question was raised to one of our history curators, Harm Stevens, and Harm Stevens did the research, and clearly, it has a provenance going back almost to the end of the Java War itself. So that was returned. The owners wanted to return this to Indonesia, and it was done through the Rijksmuseum. And as part of this, there was an exhibition held at the National Museum in Jakarta to show the objects, and there were other objects that had also belonged to Diponegoro, some also from Dutch collections. And at the time, there was a lot of internal debate also about the sculpture from the society. And so I went to Indonesia to say, actually, it's kind of rather apologetically, but to say, well, you may wonder why we're not giving back the sculpture, but in fact, we really have a lot of doubts about the provenance that has traditionally been given, and we don't think it really does belong to Diponegoro. And I was expecting a very kind of angry reaction, But actually, people were very, it was a large audience, and people were actually very interested. And it seems that many, certainly many of the well, certainly the people present, were very skeptical about objects returned to Indonesia, because they say, oh, this is the crease of Diponegoro. Well, how do they know that this is the crease of Diponegoro? They're not given actually the evidence. And so there's great skepticism in Indonesia about what is returned, which I don't think one often hears in the West. You showed a wonderful quote from the Minister of Culture, which I thought actually stated very well part of the Indonesian position, because it's not for them. It's not just about objects; it's about their history, and how that history has been written in colonial times, very much from a Dutch colonial perspective. So it's about re-examining the history of that period and coming to a much, giving actually an Indonesian perspective into that whole historical debate. And that, in many respects, is much more important than just the objects.
But that would mean, and then I'll like to have the reaction of Klaas, that part of the sources are actually not very useful, right?
Well, it depends, because the quality of the sources is hugely variable. Sometimes, we just have an old story, and what is, for Asian, perhaps for Asian curators, this is a kind of a revelation, but actually for European curators, it's not a revelation at all. The whole of European art history is full of false provenance. Whether it's the bed of Mary, Queen of Scots in Britain, which has nothing to do. It was very typical in the 19th century to give grandiose attributions to everything. So, in fact, I won't tell that story. But even in my family, yes, there was lots of jokes made about my grandmother or great-grandmother who made, ludicrous attributions to everything in her collection, which my grandfather had enjoyed sending up. It's totally typical for actually the time. But those stories today are not really of much value. And it's only in certain cases and where you have official documentation, where you can really draw a proper long history. And that was the case with the Oude Kuningedienst, and it's also the case with some of the things taken as official war booty, I think, in terms of conflicts in Indonesia, where you have something going through a state organization. But in the case of the society, they're not coming from, it's a private organization. So we've never got things from these,
military expeditions.
It's really, the archives are full of small discussions regarding private collectors and their own collection. And it's very difficult to actually get any depth, because you know who the collector is. Maybe they will say who they got it from, but then it stops. Your information stops. So it's very rare that you can say when the object came out of Indonesia or in what circumstance, because it's really not linked to those big state events or the big events of colonial history.
Klaas, would you like to reflect on that?
Yeah, of course, yes. There are so many fascinating things that you address, and so where you say that sometimes you have wrong attributions to on certain objects. That's something was from Diponegoro, and that it's very questionable if that was the case. That's of course something. Sometimes we see that as well in the objects that we research. That there is an attribution to someone, and that you try to find out, and then it crumbles apart, right? So it's not there, and that's of course you can see that as a problem if you really want to trace the ownership, the links of ownership. At the same time, and that's something that I also wanted to address in my presentation, is what you find out also says a lot about the creation of knowledge systems. And this is actually very interesting. So what you see there happening when people attribute something to, for instance, Diponegoro, is a canonization of someone. And with Diponegoro, that's obvious. I mean, he has always been a very prominent figure in Indonesian history and in Dutch colonial history. But with so many other lesser-known figures, you see already in the sources in the end 19th century, beginning of the 20th century, that you see the Pahlawan Nasional, or the Indonesian heroes, you see them all coming up actually through these wrongful attributions. And that's both on the side of Dutch or European scientists who create basically write a cultural history about civilizations that follow onto each other, and at the same time, on the Indonesian side, the creation of a national history, something else. You see it back in these objects. So if you just said, well, sometimes the sources do not really help, or they're insufficient. Sources help. It matters what kind of question you ask to that source. And if this question is sec, where does it come from and who got it, then it's insufficient. But if you open it up a little bit and ask what can we learn actually from how people experienced in this period of time history through objects, then you get all these interesting stories. And that's the thing is, we are actually in our project also struggling to what extent do we include that in our reports. Because that's then the second question. But apart from that, I find it very interesting. Yeah.
Alexandra?
Yeah, I just wanted to say, in addition, of course, to people, I mean, certainly with the Raffles Collection, it hasn't been attached to a person in Indonesia, but it's been attached to an event, that 1812 attack on Yogyakarta. And so the general belief on Java is that all of Raffles' collections came from the court. And I was giving a talk in the museum in Bandung, and one of the first on Raffles, so similar to what I gave to you today. And one of the questions that's in the Q&A was basically, have you thought about restitution? And so I started to talk a bit more about the style, and I started to talk about the fact that some of these things were gifts. And the minute I said gifts, the whole audience went, oh, a complete change in opinions and attitudes and towards this collection was suddenly maybe it wasn't all loot, maybe it had been acquired in a different way. And so I think, it's very important that we actually do thorough research into these collections so you don't perpetuate these types of stereotypes. Obviously, that doesn't mean the 1812 attack on Yogyakarta was in any way positive, but that not everything needs to stem from these horrific disasters, and we can, as you say, find larger questions and larger ways of interacting within these objects.
Yeah. Well, this lack, we could say, of written sources, because that's basically what you need. Written sources and maybe photographs, but that only goes back to, the 19th century. This is also an issue with the UN rules, of course. Written or photographic proof that objects came to Europe or Western countries before 1972. And it is a rule, the Dutch government signed this in 2008, I think. But the problem, of course, is that at the time, people didn't know. Huh? So it's going backwards. And if they had known, they might have asked for documents or photographs or whatever. But this is all, we seem to be dealing with an enormous lack of trustworthy sources, and which are mainly defined as written sources, whereas in the countries, in the indigenous cultures, not always had a writing history, writing culture. So what about oral history? Is this something that comes up from Indonesia or other Asian countries?
Yeah.
Well, in the case of Raffles, I mean, I think the thing that we need to look at is not, obviously, we haven't got any written. I mean, if we did have written, and I don't know that Raffles did write this stuff down, because I said in my talk, these things weren't valued in the early 19th century. So even if he did write it down, of course, that all burned and sank. So again, we are imposing kind of a European style or Western style of knowledge, on objects that didn't. So we have to start looking at, stylistic things and at coloration. And certainly in terms of the Raffles collection, we have, a number of puppet makers and puppeteers that I met have been very pleased that these objects were taken out of Java, because if they had remained in Java and been used, then they would have, the paint flaked, they would have been scraped clean and repainted, say every few years. So we actually have a very good historic record of, so these things can provide us with information about the past. We don't necessarily need to only value them for, historic records about them. I think we have to think more broadly than just texts. And certainly that's very dear to my heart as an art historian, where you're not necessarily looking at
the objects
text.
themselves
The
tell
objects
stories.
themselves tell stories too, and I think we have to take that into consideration.
Yep. Right.
One comment I'd like to make on the on Raffles' destruction of the Kraton and Yogyakarta and that history, because I met the historian Peter Carey, who's really a great authority on that whole period, and he delights in telling me that the only royal Kraton in Java ever destroyed by European colonial forces was the Kraton of Yogyakarta by Stamford Raffles in 1812. But at the time, he also found after the taking of the Kraton, there was very typically for that period, there was a report published into the looting and describing, okay, what was looted from the Kraton. And in that report, it said that most of the stuff that was looted was actually jewelry. It was sirade. And I was going to say, well, is this because the Anglo-Irish troops involved had a fascination for Indonesian jewelry design? I doubt it. The reason they stole jewelry was because it's small, you can grab it. It's mostly made of gold, so you can break it up. You can sell the gold in any market in Asia. You can take out the stones, sell them at any jewelers in Europe. In other words, it's something to be turned into money. And what is so what I appreciate about the Raffles collection is that you look at it and I think he was interested in everything. Absolutely everything, from the animals to the textiles to the puppets, you name it. And this is very typical of the British Enlightenment and the kind of people who came out of that. And yes, they were full of full of their own, a sense of their own importance, and they were all hugely ambitious. But actually, yes, that interest in other people's culture is something which I think the society, that is something we can really value. And the kind of private collection he built up is something that, yes, was followed by many, many people, many Europeans, many Dutch collectors in the years since.
If I can just add to that, in the process of working on the Raffles collection, I was reading other European descriptions or British descriptions of this attack on Yogyakarta. And what was so interesting to me is over and over again, they kept on saying things like, there was nothing to loot, there was nothing to take. And I'm thinking, if you walk into a house, a stately home in Britain, I mean, it's full of stuff. You have ceramics, and you have the silver, and you've got the rugs, and the tapestries, and the curtains, and the furniture. And of course, you're going to have a completely different way of displaying your wealth and status in Java, like I was talking about with the textile patterns, the patterns on batik, for example, that people would wear, not something that the Europeans would even think about, but something that the Javanese thought about. Again, so the British would walk into Jogja, and there wasn't anything there that they could connect with, I think. But you can connect with jewelry.
Yes.
Jewelry is very easy to connect with. Europeans, of course, also wore jewelry, even if the style was different. So I think, again, it's like that. You're not going to go in and loot the shadow puppets. What relevance does that have to European society? And I think that's part of why Raffles collected the way he did, was he was trying to make Javanese society, he tried to interpret it for European ideas. And that's why you have the shape of that collection. And in a sense, that's why he didn't get most of it looting from Jogja, because that wasn't what he was trying to do. What he was trying to do was to create an argument the way you do when you write an article or a book. He was creating, in a sense, he was an early museum curator. He was pulling together a certain body of objects to make a specific point.
Yeah. And he didn't succeed, right?
So, no, he didn't really succeed.
Convince the East Asian company to actually stay in Java.
Yeah. No.
They even presented him with a bill.
They presented him with a bill. Yes.
So your idea of the Enlightenment, in a way, he was a pioneer. He was too early. They were not interested. The British Museum didn't want to buy the collection.
No, oh yes, I forgot to say that. So we were actually offered, the British Museum was offered the collection in 1858 for sale for £1,000 by the executor of Lady Raffles' estate, and we said no. We turned it down, we didn't want it. And then only in 1859, when it was offered as a gift, did we say yes. But I will say...
It's almost Dutch.
I will say we didn't even really want it. It was great reluctance. And actually when the executor, William Raffles Flint, went back 4 years later, he said we displayed it terribly. We had all the puppets in a heap in the bottom of a case, and he said that the musical instruments weren't arranged properly. But I will say the British Museum has a big ethnographic collection, but even today we're not particularly interested, and certainly in the 19th century, one of the directors was quoted as saying that when somebody asked him whether these various collections were actually displayed in the basement, and he said yes, they were, and he felt that that was a good place for them, and if it was up to him, we wouldn't have them at all.
And there is no Southeast Asian department anymore in the British Museum.
No. So we have right now we have no Southeast. We have a long-term plan, but it's really a 30 years plan. And we will eventually, one day, have a Southeast Asia gallery again, but right now,
Has the Indonesian state ever knocked on your door and said that they would like to have given back some pieces?
No, we've never had anything official. I do get varying opinions. So sometimes we have people saying, oh, it's a good thing you have them because now we have evidence of early 19th century coloring and design. And then other people say it was all looted from Jogja. How come you're not giving it back? But again, I think, we have to have a nuanced approach. We have to really look as William has shown us
Well,
very
it's interesting
specifically.
because for a few years, Java was a colony of the English in a way, huh? The British.
Oh, absolutely.
But they didn't knock on your door, where it was a short period of time, but it was actually,
But I
same
wonder how
situation.
much of that also has to do with the type of objects. Certainly there's been, so the British Library has a lot of the manuscripts that were looted from the Jogja court. But they were given in the end by John Crawford and also by, oh my goodness, I'm drawing a blank, one other man. And so they've been digitizing them and they've been working with the court at Jogjakarta to send digital copies back, I think to make loans. But no, nobody's ever come to us. And again, I think it has to do with the type of objects that we have. I think shadow puppets perhaps are not quite as high in the ranking as
stone sculpture.
stone sculptures or books.
Probably. Ja.
Because
Ja, vragen.
yeah.
Vragen uit de zaal? Ja?
Sorry. Oh,
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
I just wanted to make one comment, which was that there was, letters, called letters, sent to Raffles by different rulers in different parts of the archipelago. And there was an exhibition, I think by Annabel Gallop some years ago, but just of these letters. And they're sensational because they're so beautifully presented, some with silk borders, beautiful calligraphy in all different scripts. And there was just a tiny exhibition in the British Museum of that, I think 20 years ago, just of the letters sent to him himself. And they're sensational. And you think, my grief. And what is so interesting is the period from which they're from. I mean, the fact that they've been preserved this time, and they're so sensational, and nobody, up to modern times, has really taken any interest in these things. It's extraordinary.
Het is.
Yeah, maybe also for the audience. So, the question about the sources, I think it's very good also to note that it's all, if you take the whole range of sources that are at our dispossession, then we can write beautiful histories about virtually everything. But when you follow certain objects, then you have the problem on the one hand that it's very difficult to link all those sources to that specific object. So you find fantastic letters and you want to write an article about it immediately, but it has nothing to do with your object right in front of you. But on the other hand, it's also quite interesting is that if you let it go and then say, okay, let me just follow that object, that you find all kinds of histories that are sometimes also against your intuition and against the categories and the ideas that you already have about collecting, for instance, in the 20th century, that it brings you sudden insights, and in that sense, it connects also what you were saying, like the object itself it can be a source. Sometimes something is written on it, or we have seen symbols that tell you something about from who it was in Banjarmasin area, for instance. But the source can also be a guide, and that's very nice that you let the source. The object can also be a guide through all kinds of histories. That's what we also find. So, yeah.
I think there's a question. Time for questions, I think.
Sure.
Sure.
yeah.
I have a question with regard to the PROCE project, because we saw it is funded until March 2022, which is pretty nearby. And it's very interesting what you told us about the research. It's very thorough. And the idea is also to work on a methodology. But what does the future look like? Because NIOD has so much experience also in other areas, of course. And what is going to happen? Is there any idea yet?
Yeah, well, there are a lot of ideas, but no certainty. I think so. The formal, like the strict, the answer is that we are all actually waiting for a new cabinet to arrive with a new minister of culture, because the previous minister already she took over some of the recommendations of that committee of Lilian Gonçalves Hokangiu. But for instance, the recommendation that there should be a center of expertise, that was still a bit left out or unclear. So we will see what the new Minister of Culture will say about this. On the other hand, yeah, of course, within our project, we do everything to bring the results, or to find ways to make these results accessible also in the future for different audiences. And yeah, so it's really a collaboration between NIOD, Rijksmuseum and NMVW. So I'm sure that in the future there will be something created and that we can then take all the experiences with us. And yeah, we don't know if it's us as pros 0.2 or 2.0. Or something else that we don't know. But I'm sure that the experiences will not just disappear, and yeah, that's at least what I hope.
And new research projects have started, huh? VU University,
yeah, of course, yeah.
with Leiden, and
yeah, you have pressing matter. That's something that's
research from Jakarta.
Yeah, exactly. There's many initiatives these years. I think also in the UK and everywhere, new projects are coming up. So this program or this project is here to stay. And we don't know in what way, but yeah.
How many objects are you investigating?
Yeah, well, we always say a couple of dozens, just to keep it open. It should be somewhere between 50 and 80. Yeah, but that also depends on, people are actually working right now. I'm not alone. That's also good to say and good to mention that we have, maybe 6 researchers right now, and also other people from the museums that are also involved. So, like in total, we have maybe 10 to 15 people involved in some kind of way. I'm not the only one.
And it's all Indonesian and Sri Lankan objects.
Yeah,
right?
exactly. Yeah. Exactly.
Because it's a pilot project, of course, yes.
Yes.
Well,
Yeah.
eager to learn more. Any questions from the room, please?
Flying reporter.
Mevrouw Paul.
Yes. I have a question for Alexandra. As you are working in the British Museum, do you know what happened to that big problem of the huge Buddha images in the Ashmolean Museum? Indian government wanted to take it back, but so far there was no solution of that problem. Ashmolean Museum didn't want to give it back, so what happened in between, I don't know. Do you have any idea?
Sorry, which object?
The famous Buddha, more than life-size image in the Ashmolean Museum, made of bronze.
Ashmolean.
Okay, the bronze from the one from Sri Lanka?
No, from India wanted to have it back.
I don't know. I'm afraid I don't know.
This could be.
Do you know what happened?
Do you mean the big Gupta-style Sultan Ganj Buddha?
Tanganj image.
Yes, because this actually it's in the Birmingham City Gallery, I think, because I visited it. The history of it is complicated because it was found in the mid-19th century, and it was an industrialist heard about it. I think he was working with the railway, and he bought the sculpture and took it back to Birmingham because he was from Birmingham. And it's now in a gallery, but the gallery is really devoted to kind of, it's not even an ethnographic gallery, it's a kind of community religious gallery with most of the objects are much more mundane. And the condition of it, it was really just transported directly, I think, to the UK. And it was, I think it's also painted with something. It has a very dark appearance, but that's not its original color. And it needs, it definitely needs, even if it was agreed to go back to India, it would not survive the journey, I don't think. It really needs some heavy conservation. But it's a problem because I think it was given to the museum by the donor on the basis that it would always remain in Birmingham. So I don't think it's even been loaned to exhibitions in England. So it's a big, yeah, I think I don't know of any new developments for that.
Who else?
Mrs. Green,
Yes.
thank you for your lecture. Is Raffles regarded in the tradition of Hans Sloane in Britain?
I would say that Raffles isn't known in Britain, I'm afraid. I mention Raffles to people, most people kind of look very puzzled, and I say Singapore, and then there's kind of a bit more of a comprehension, and then they say, oh, the Raffles Hotel. So I would say, I will say that imperial history doesn't seem to be taught very much at school. So most people actually don't know very much, unfortunately. So I don't think people really even think about Raffles. So, I mean, it's very disappointing. But that's been most of the response that I've had. People just don't know anything about him. And they certainly don't know that Britain was on Java between 1811 and 1815. So it's, I mean, certainly if my daughter's education is anything to go by, they've done the 6 Wives of Henry VIII so many times, I can't even count. But they have done nothing with empire. They do World War I, they do the Nazis, and they do the Tudors.
Yes.
And then the whole 19th century and that whole British Empire is just given a miss. It's very problematic. I think there was a poll of people, must be a little while ago now, maybe 10 years ago, and they asked what people thought about the British Empire, and most people, 68%, thought it had been a very good idea and that the British should have it back again. So that really there's a huge level of ignorance about the whole empire and the British past for the past 250 years. So it's yeah, I was quite surprised at how few people knew who Raffles even was. So I guess that was a very long answer. So the short answer is no. He's not considered on
Maybe
the same
if he'd
level as
have
Sloane.
had his own museum like Sloane, it would have been different, but he didn't.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, I would absolutely support what you've just said because I was taught the Tudors and the Second World War, and that's all anybody knows. But the lack of ignorance on the colonial period is hugely problematic because also there's very little revision of colonial history. And this is a big problem anyway because the colonial archives for the 18th, 19th centuries are written by European administrators. And they give the European view, their view, of what happened. And it's an inbuilt bias. And you have this, because there's so little indigenous documentation to counter that, you end up with, it's very difficult to step outside the archive and to say, well, actually, what did happen? Because you're just getting a European view. And in terms of, I haven't done a lot with Dutch colonial history, but I did do some in British colonial history, and the errors are stark, but they're not pointed out. And for example, with Myanmar, with Burma, you look back at the 19th century histories, And yeah, or the early 20th century. And there's enough there to know that what you're reading is wrong, but it's not corrected. It's not corrected. Because people also, even today, people prioritize the European account. And you may kind of color it with a little bit of if there's some very strong tradition in the country itself, you may color that, but essentially it's a very colonial narrative. And changing that is going to be very difficult.
Well,
One more
Meneer
question.
van
Sorry,
Erp, can I
Yeah.
just respond to
Yeah,
what
sure.
William said? I'm sorry. I think that has to do with, again, what I'm saying about most of these things are texts. The information you're going to get from particularly Southeast Asia might be oral histories, it might, other forms. But in West, we prioritize texts. And so that's what you have. And again, it's about, what Raffles was doing. You're taking information about something foreign, and how do you then make it relevant to your cultural context?
Yeah.
And I think you do that by writing things down in the archives. But in Southeast Asia, that was not necessarily the way you made sense of information and how you crystallized your context. So, again, it's about how do you actually understand a foreign culture on their own terms, not on how do you interpret it so you can understand it on your terms. So I'm sorry, I've
Go ahead. Mag even gaan staan. Well, thank you, William, to tell the story about my grandfather, Theo van Erp. I'm his grandson. And I recognize his writing. That was not much left of him because his house was bombed, by the British in 1945 in Bezuidenhout. But very interesting story. I would like to elaborate a little bit more. I think lately was something, a little article published about him in the AK, I think, so perhaps he's a little bit more known. He was on the board of the VVRK from the beginning, more or less, so that's also perhaps not. And, well, perhaps a little joke, ironical to say what you said about the, what to do with the giving back things to Indonesia. And, perhaps because he restored the Borobudur. And what cost, I think, 400,000 guilders at that time. Well, if we have to give something back, perhaps we can say, well, we have made some cost in 1910 for you, 400,000 guilders, 20 times more at the moment. So perhaps it is a negotiation object for the Indonesian. I give that to you. And I'm very interested in the story about the Oudheidkundige Dienst and the Indonesians afterwards. Because if you know perhaps that Aus Bernhard Kempers was also director Indonesian times of the Oudheidkundige Dienst. So there is also a discussion who is responsible for what happened before and what is the situation at the moment. But thank you.
I would just say that one thing which for me is important is you can make general statements about a particular era, the role of the Dutch government in it, but when it comes to individuals, historical individuals, you have got to do justice to that individual. And if somebody has spent, like Theo van Erp, 30 years of their life restoring Javanese temples and antiquities, it's rather rough on that individual to then say, oh, this is somebody who looted stuff from Indonesia. You've got to make that distinction because, it matters. Why it matters, I don't know. But in terms of, you can say, well, okay, somebody's been dead for 100 years. What does it matter what we think of Raffles? But actually, it matters what you say about people and their reputation. It does matter. And I think so I was very nervous about presenting that letter because it gives a completely wrong view of what he was doing. It's completely the opposite what he was doing.
He was very humoristic.
Okay, any more comments or questions or things you would like to
Yeah,
put forward?
oh yeah, sorry, I have a microphone. Sorry. That's a privilege. Now, just about, so the question is Raffles even remembered? And what, it's also interesting to think about that, and I'm afraid with prose we also kind of build onto that, is that every country in the West builds on their own historic empire, and so we are again interested in Indonesia and in well, Sri Lanka for time was also in Dutch possession, but at the same time you see that, for instance, the story about Raffles is a story about British involvement in Indonesia. The same with Bencoolen was also an area. You have East Timor, of course, with the Portuguese link. Then you have the Philippines, which you sometimes cannot easily divide between the Netherlands and Spain and the US. And you see objects from these areas ending up all around Europe and not really sticking to these colonial empires. And so that might also be a reason why Raffles is less remembered, maybe even among people who are more knowledgeable, is the fact that he was then active on Java and not so much, well, later also in Singapore. But this is also something that if we are doing provenance research today, we have to think about that as well, that the borders that we draw and that have been drawn in history during the colonial times are not self-evident, and that objects travel really through the whole, well, the south, so the whole Southeast Asia, basically. It was an archipelago, so people traveled, took objects with them. There was trade, there was influence, cultural influence, and so it's always, yeah, there's something that we also need to think about, that we should not continue on that line to subdivide
It's not
everything.
a one-way street, you mean? It's not only going east to west, but intercultural.
So, for instance, we sometimes have objects that that if we ask a curator about, he will say, well, that object is typically from that and that area on Kalimantan. And then, but if you look at it, it has all these elements and also features that really demonstrate that there was influence from the whole region, and then the object itself traveled also through. For instance, it was collected on Aceh, right? In Aceh. So it's where do you go with your really pinpointing an object to a certain region and then say it's from that region?
Cultures mix, and that is part of the problem. And provenance research is easier when you sort of purify the story, but which is also making it smaller.
Yeah.
If I can just say, one of the ways that we deal with, I'm sorry. I just say one of the ways we deal with that at the British Museum is oftentimes for colonial or objects collected during colonial times, we don't say where they were made, we say where they were found. We have a find spot listing, as opposed to, you'd say it was found in Aceh, as opposed to maybe it was made in Malaysia or something. So, and the British were in the Philippines too. For a very
There's
short amount of time.
one more question.
Yes, please.
My name is Gies van den Kamp. Hi. Shouldn't we just stop with thinking where objects physically are? In the time that we have the internet and the ownership of objects is in fact a burden. It's costing money. You can't trade anything. You can't make money out of it anymore like you could before. So the one who ends up with the object is the one who has to pay and to care for it. So is it really attractive to have all these objects? Shouldn't we just work on sharing the information? And who cares who owns? The one who is able to care for it and pay for it, let him or her have it. And let's put our energy in sharing the information via internet, via 3D scans, copying, sending things all over the world, traveling around, having it one year here, 1 year there.
Yeah, but that's already happening since decades. Huh? For instance, the
not
Batavia's Genootschap had its collection both in Batavia, now Jakarta, and Leiden.
Yeah.
And since more than 3 decades, their main purpose is to cooperate with the National Museum in Jakarta, also on conservation, research, etc. So that is the trend.
But sometimes I don't.
And it's made easier because we have digital communication now.
But shouldn't we do that much, much more?
Many collections are online too. So that gives the public access even when the museum's closed. So this is really an extra thing, I guess. But the object itself needs care.
Yeah.
It's cultural heritage.
Yeah,
so
but
it needs to be
sometimes I don't trust
kept.
our own minister. If I see the photo in the newspaper handing over an object to a minister of Indonesia, I see her think, yes, let's get rid of these costs of caring for it.
Right. I think we're, well, in a way.
It's an interesting question that you raise, but the main thing is there's a lot of information flowing all over the world, and the internet has helped us tremendously in research with regard to the history and the provenance of items, and that is something that will continue. I also believe that ownership will continue, and that, museums or private collectors will love what they have and will look after it. And when they pass away, or when there's time, they will sell it, and it will pass on. It's not, yes, or donate it to museums and de Koninklijke Vereniging van Vrienden der Aziatische Kunst. This is a question of the future that we cannot answer. But William has something to say, a final statement.
I always have, but I would just say that you need to preserve the object, but you also need to preserve interest in the object. It's got to be worthwhile having the object. If the object is somewhere where nobody has any remote interest in it, then should it be there? That is because, that's all I want to say. Because the object itself, you can 3D scan, any object you like, but actually the object itself contains a huge range of information which you can't carbon-14 date the 3D scan. You can't study what type of feather is on it. So you need to preserve the object, but there has to be an interest in it, and not just one or two, sad people like us, but actually there has to be a broad interest. Yeah. Ja.
Eén ding is zeker, we zien dat de belangstelling voor musea en collecties, of het nu gaat om Aziatica of om 17e-eeuwse kunst, die groeit. En er is steeds meer belangstelling voor. En dat brengt dan ook weer meer belangstelling naar de geschiedenis van dingen. En de benadering van de musea en van ons en universiteiten om steeds meer te willen weten over het object en de geschiedenis van het object en wat daarbij hoort. Dat is iets, dat zal alleen maar meer worden en dat is heel belangrijk en wij geloven daar ook in. Maar het is 4 uur geweest in feite, dus dat betekent ook dat de live chat, althans de livestream, ook tot een einde komt en dat onze bijeenkomst tot een einde komt. Eén ding is zeker, we hebben gezien, er zijn vele vragen en er is nog veel te leren en het komt weer terug, het onderwerp komt weer terug. All these subjects will return on our plate and we will continue to discuss it, Alexandra. En met u samen en met het onderzoek. En wij hopen natuurlijk dat Proost de kans krijgt om verder te gaan met de ontwikkeling van de methodologie. Want dat is gewoon heel erg belangrijk. En het zou natuurlijk ontzettend jammer zijn als daar een soort chop komt. Om wat voor reden dan ook. Het is eigenlijk een ongelukkige situatie natuurlijk. Dat je in september nog niet weet wat je eind maart gaat doen, nietwaar? Dat is wel een beetje gek voor zo'n belangrijk project. Maar goed, dat is even een soort final statement daarover. Ja, Ik ga sluiten. Ik dank alle sprekers. Taco Dibbets, die ons per video heeft toegesproken. Klaas Stukje, voor je interessante uitleg over het PROCE-rapport. Alexandra Green, thank you so much. Traveling to continental Europe.
I know.
And with all the burdens that go with it, the testing, and it is great that we made it after all, because 4 times we had to postpone, and now it really fitted in this wonderful symposium in a very nice way. And I hope you will enjoy Amsterdam a bit today, and that we will see you back in time.
I just want to say thank you so much for inviting me. It's been a real pleasure to be here. So.
Great. Dan William, also, thank you very much. Very interesting what you told us and what you showed, and you will continue. We know how thorough you are and really plunging all the way in all the materials that are available. And the bruikleen issue we will discuss further, no doubt. And that will be interesting. Ook de organisatoren, René, hartelijk dank, ook voor de Q&A. Rosalien, nu niet meer achter het scherm, maar daar. Hartelijk dank. Ook Marleen, die vandaag er niet bij kon zijn. Ook dank alle thuiskijkers, hartelijk dank. Het Rijksmuseum en Sandra Pastoor van het Rijksmuseum, dat ons zo heeft geholpen, de zaal ook ter beschikking heeft gesteld. Dat mogen we toch ook nog wel eventjes gedenken. En natuurlijk het hele team van Fantavision. Geweldig wat jullie hebben gedaan. Het mooie is, wat er vandaag is besproken, als u even met de concentratie weg was, of u dacht, ik wil het nog een keertje zien. Het komt compleet op YouTube, dan kunt u het nog een keer bekijken. En we hopen dat we een goed bereik hebben gehad vandaag met dit programma, wat dan ook experimenteel tegelijkertijd in die livestream is uitgezonden. Ja, ik wens u nog een fijn weekend. En Rosalien, die zal nog wat mooie cadeautjes uitdelen.
Dankjewel. Nee, dat hoop ik ook niet.
Verschillende
Dankjewel.
Ik wens u allemaal nog een heel fijn weekend. U kunt nog even nu genieten natuurlijk van het Aziatisch paviljoen. Pak je kans, want er komt 18 oktober alweer, hoor ik van Menno, een nieuwe wissel. En daar hangen erg mooie dingen, waaronder de scrolls, de schenking Hess, de Zen scrolls hangen daar in de grote vitrine. Nou ja, en nog maar 4 weken en dan is het alweer weg. We gaan er nog wel een mooie film over maken in onze videoreeks die komt. En daar hangen Surimono-prenten. Dus kijkt u even nog daar. Menno, wil je daar nog iets over toevoegen? Is er nog iets anders? Nee. Oké. Goed. Dus pak uw kansen. Dank u wel. Fijn weekend en tot ziens bij hopelijk weer veel drukker bezochte bijeenkomsten in de komende tijd.